It was a typical Saturday morning, filled with the usual errands and a long list of things to do. But the yard sale today sign caught my eye as I drove past, and before I knew it, I found myself pulling over. It was set up in the front yard of a small, weathered house. Nothing really special, just the typical kind of yard sale that you see around here. But as I walked up, I noticed an old, unlabeled cardboard box sitting on the ground near the back of the table. It was dusty and looked like it hadn't been moved in years, and I crouched down and picked it up, feeling the weight of it in my hands. It wasn't very heavy, but it was strangely solid, like there was a lot of stuff inside it. The lid was taped down and the edges were frayed. I asked what was inside, and the middle-aged man running the sale told me, "Just a box of old stuff. Feel free to take a look." I lifted the lid, carefully peeling away the tape, and then peered inside. The contents were a strange mix of items. There were a few old hair bands, a couple of rusted keys, a small hairbrush, and some photographs. But the one thing that stood out were all the newspaper clippings. They were all yellowed with age and crinkled along the edges, and I picked one up and read the headline, and when I did, I sort of felt a chill run down my spine. "Missing person, Jane Doe," it said. There were several clippings, all about the same person, a woman whose body had been found decades ago in a nearby town. I flipped through the articles, reading the details. Her body had been found in the early 90s, and partly because she was never identified, her murder went unsolved. The articles described Jane Doe as a young brunette, last seen visiting a local diner, but as I sifted through the clippings, I discovered more disturbing details. There were photographs tucked in among them, grainy, black and white images of a woman who matched Jane Doe's, walking alone in a parking lot, entering a store, or sitting on a bench. There were also personal items in the box. The hairbrush that I mentioned, a few pieces of jewelry, and some clothing. They were old, worn, and had a very musty smell. The seller was still standing behind the table, not really looking at me, and wasn't really saying a word. I glanced up at him, wondering if he knew anything about this Jane Doe. But he just stood there, silent and very indifferent. It was as if though he was waiting for me to leave so he could go back inside the house. I asked if he knew who the woman was, and he looked at it and just sort of shrugged. He said he found the box in his attic, had never opened it, and had no idea what was inside. But his answer didn't really sit right with me. How could he not care about what was inside that box? It wasn't just old stuff, it was part of someone's life, and it was somehow connected to some terrible unsolved murder. I wanted to press him for more information, but there was something about him that told me he wasn't interested in talking, and so I began reading the newspaper clipping more carefully. There were mentions of a man, Jane's boyfriend at the time that she went missing. He was a local guy, well known in town, but no one had seen him since the day that he disappeared. His name was mentioned in the articles, but there were no photos of him. As I pieced together the story, I began to wonder if the seller knew more than he was letting on. Maybe he was connected to the case somehow. Maybe he was hiding something. Could he have been involved in this Jane's disappearance, or was he telling the truth about just finding it in his home? I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than I was seeing, and I had to know more, but I didn't know where to start. The newspaper clippings were a dead end. They were decades old, and the people mentioned in them were long gone, so I decided to take the box with me. I paid that seller a few dollars for it and walked back to my car and then drove back home. When I got home, I laid all the clippings on my kitchen table in this sort of jumbled mess of information, and I tried to make sense of it all. But it was sort of like piecing together a puzzle with missing pieces, and the whole situation was very unsettling, and every clipping seemed to only raise more questions than they had answered. When my husband eventually arrived home, I showed him what I brought home from the yard sale, and at first he looked at me like I was nuts. But after he read through some of the clippings and took a look at the other more personal items, he started to see what I did. Anyone with photographs of Jane Doe would have surely known her identity, in which case, why didn't they come forward when they learned of her murder? I remember my husband said how, logically speaking, the photos and the clippings might not be connected. Someone might have just put a bunch of stuff in a box and without once stopping to consider how it might be interpreted when opened by complete strangers. And why the hell would they? But I doubted that very, very much. That seemed like way too much of a coincidence. If there was a bunch of old lottery tickets and a sewing kit in there, then yeah, maybe it was just a junk box. But everything was too personal, too deliberate. It almost felt like a trophy. My husband didn't want to believe it at first, saying I was just overreacting after getting in my own head about it. But I told him I was convinced. That wasn't just some random brunette lady. It was the murdered woman. It was Jane Doe. He didn't tell me when it clicked for him, but when I reached for the box, he almost snapped at me when he said, "Don't touch it." And that's when I knew that he believed it too. He didn't want me to touch anymore because he realized that it might actually be forensic evidence, something which, in my excitement, I hadn't considered at all up until that point. We got in touch with the police the next morning. They came and took the box, and then as far as I know, they went to talk to the guy that had hosted the yard sale about how exactly he'd come to own it. I called one of the officers that we spoke to a while later, and he said that the box and everything in it had been entered into Jane Doe's evidence file, and while it hadn't exactly blown open the case, it was certainly a development in what had been a decades-old unsolved murder. That was just about the only half-decent thing about this whole story. That somehow, and even if it was only a little, I actually helped. One morning, a few months ago during the summer, I decided to check out the yard sale down the street. Yard sales have always really interested me because you never know what kinds of treasures you might stumble across. And that morning, there was a nice crowd already picking through the tables as I walked up. Then I spotted an old lawn chair that looked just like the one my grandma used to have, so I made my way over to take a closer look. As I was giving the chair that closer look, I heard raised voices not too far away. It was coming from a lady who was standing by a table full of dishes and kitchen gadgets. She wasn't yelling or anything, but you could tell that there was some kind of disagreement happening. The lady was arguing with an older man who looked to be in his late 60s over a set of china plates that were all nicely arranged in a cardboard box, probably hoping to sell as a set. The woman was pointing at the plates and saying something I couldn't quite make out. Neither of them were hosting the sale either. Both were people from the neighborhood who'd come looking for a deal. I didn't think much of it at first, because as surprising as it sounds, some people can get pretty heated at yard sales. It's like they forget that they're just trying to get rid of junk that they don't need anymore, and some people take it very personally if you imply that something isn't as valuable as they think it is. And then occasionally, you get two potential buyers arguing over an item they both want, which appeared to be what was happening here. At first, it was just the lady getting very confrontational, but then the older man started raising his voice too, and the whole scene got more intense. He was pointing back at her, and they were exchanging words I couldn't really understand because they were both talking over each other about a mile a minute. I was still looking at that chair at first, not looking, but listening in. But then by the time they started actually yelling at each other, my curiosity got the better of me, and I couldn't help but glance over at the argument. Other people were turning to look too. One guy even set down the book that he was flipping through to see what was going on. Then the next thing, the host of the yard sale is walking over saying something like, Hey, take it easy." But then, before the guy can even get over there, the lady grabs one of the plates and raises it up above her head. I thought for sure that she was about to smash that plate or something, like a sort of, if I can't have it, no one can kind of deal. But the second she did, the older man lunges toward her, and because he's a little taller than her, grabs the plate with ease, but then starts trying to wrestle it out of her grip. The lady has one hand on the plate, another on her purse, but then the older guy puts two hands on the plate, and then sort of turns his body as he's pulling it out of her hands. He succeeds in pulling it out of her grip, but as he does, he loses his balance and falls. He hit the ground, and we heard the plate smash, and then the guy let out this very long and painful grunt, and just from the way it sounded, I knew that it was probably bad. And everyone seemed stunned. They all heard the same thing I did, and they must have known that something was bad too. But there was just this moment where no one moved and no one said anything, almost like we were hoping that things wouldn't be as bad as they looked. The woman froze, staring down at the man who lay on his front, not moving, and seconds later, we saw this blood start to ooze from underneath him, and the woman started screaming. People rushed to the older guy's aid, telling him not to move and yelling for someone to call 911. But the lady that had been in the scuffle with him just stood there, completely in shock, saying, oh my God, over and over. The folks that rushed over to help rolled the guy over so they could try and stop the bleeding, but that's when everyone saw the big shard of porcelain sticking out of the guy's stomach. The lady who had been in the scuffle started to cry as we did everything we could to stop the bleeding, and the man just sort of laid there, breathing heavily, his eyes wide open. Thankfully, the paramedics arrived fast, closely followed by the cops. Then, after the ambulance took the older guy off, the cops started taking statements from us. I didn't have much to say. I was just there to buy a lawn chair, not get involved in a yard sale showdown that ended up in someone dying. And the lady involved in the scuffle just cried and cried. And I don't think it was entirely her fault that the guy had fallen. Like it was all just a horrible accident, I suppose. But at the time, she clearly blamed herself for what had happened, and some people in the crowd did too. I think the cops then drove her home to talk to her more at her house. And later, as I walked back home, I couldn't shake the image of that man lying on the ground. It was the way that he was staring up at the sky, very wide-eyed and scared, more scared than I'd ever seen anyone in my whole life, and I can't imagine what must have been going through his head. And neither can I imagine what was going through the lady's head when she found out that the guy had actually passed. I found out from my neighbor the next day, and when I told him I was actually there, he asked me what had happened. And I told him that they were both being just childish, fighting over a piece of porcelain. And my neighbor then asked if the lady pushed the guy, and I said no, that he fell because he was sort of wrenching the plate away from the lady so hard that he spun around when it left her hands. I said that it seemed like the lady started it, but then again, I only heard her voice first, you know? The older man could have easily said something under his breath, and that's what started the whole thing. The whole thing felt like equal blame on each side, but in the end, it was a life lost and a life ruined. Really, neither of them deserved that. I guess once they got the full story, the older guy's family didn't press any charges, but the lady still left town not long after, I'm pretty sure. Even though it was all but publicly declared that she wasn't to blame, people still said that she killed that guy. It was like they wanted it to be her fault, just so they had someone to blame. And they didn't exactly go driving her out of town afterwards, but I guess all their stares and hushed words got too much for her, and she eventually moved on of her own accord. To me, it's just crazy how something as simple as an argument in a yard sale can end up in such tragedy. One second it's a nice day, people were out taking walks, and then the next, a dude's dead. A few years back, I decided to hold a yard sale. My garage was overflowing with junk, old furniture, boxes of books, clothes that didn't fit anymore. So I just figured it was time to clear out some space and maybe make a little money while I was at it. And by 10 a.m. on Sunday morning, my driveway was packed with tables covered in stuff that I thought that I might sell. Neighbors came and went, poking around, asking prices. Some haggled, some just handed over crumpled bills. But for the most part, they smiled politely and made a little small talk and then moved on. And by mid-morning, strangers were starting to notice the sale as they were walking or driving by. And then the more people gathered, the more people noticed the sale, so by maybe 11 to 11:30, I was getting quite a lot of foot traffic and making quite a few sales. And at one point, I noticed a man lingering by a table of tools, picking up a wrench and then a hammer, and turning them over in his hands like he was deciding one or another. He was wearing a faded gray t-shirt, jeans, and a Dodgers cap. Nothing very unusual about him, but something about the way his eyes darted around that made me very uneasy. On the assumption that he was looking around for the person running the sale, I walked over and introduced myself. The guy then said he was interested in the tools and then asked if I had any more, but his voice was sort of flat, like he was reading from a script but very badly. I pointed to a box of odds and ends near the back of the driveway and he nodded and then walked over slowly. By noon, it was just a trickle of people wandering in and out. I was very tired and ready to pack it in, and that's when I noticed the man in the Dodgers cap again, meaning he'd been hanging around for almost an hour without buying anything. He was hanging around the edge of the driveway, pacing past the tables like he hadn't already seen everything 3 times over. But then, he wasn't looking at the stuff anymore. He seemed like he was looking at me. I tried to ignore him, announced that I was about to pack up, and then focused on the last few shoppers. A woman asked about a lamp. A teenager bought a stack of DVDs, but the whole time I kept an eye on the man in the Dodgers cap, all while trying my best to pretend that I wasn't. When the driveway was finally empty except for him, I started packing up. I told him the sale was over, that I needed to get everything back inside. He didn't leave. He just stood there, watching me, his hands shoved into his pockets. I started to get a little nervous, but told myself that he was obviously harmless, just a little odd, and that I was anxious. I loaded a couple of boxes in the garage, keeping one eye on him, but when I turned back, he had moved closer. He was standing in the middle of the driveway by that point, looking down at one of the tables, and he said something about the tools again, but his tone made it sound like he wasn't really asking. I told him that they weren't for sale anymore, that I was done for the day. He nodded, but he didn't leave. Instead, he reached down and picked up a hammer, turning it over in his hands again. And in that moment, my throat went dry. I told him to put it down, to leave, but he just stared at me, like he was thinking, making up his mind. I don't know what set him off, though. Maybe it was the way that I said it, or maybe he had been planning this all along. One second, he was standing there, and the next, he was moving towards me, and fast. I backed up, my feet stumbling over the edge of the driveway. He raised the hammer and I turned to run. I barely made it to the garage before he grabbed me, his fingers digging into my arm. I twisted away, yanking free, but then tripped over a box. I think it was of books. It was right behind me, looming over me as I scrambled backwards, searching for anything that I could grab. My hand closed around something solid and heavy, a wrench from the box that he had looked through earlier. I swung it without thinking, the metal connecting with a very sickening thud, and he stumbled back, clutching his shoulder, his face twisted in pain and rage. And I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I scrambled to my feet and ran, bolting through the side door into the house. I slammed it shut behind me, locked it, and then pressed my back against the door, listening for any sound outside. It was quiet for a moment, and then I heard the crunch of footsteps on the gravel moving away. I crept to the window, peeking out through the blinds. It was gone. The driveway was empty, the yard sale tables scattered with what was left of my things. I called the police, my voice shaking as I explained what had happened, and to my relief, they arrived quicker than I thought they would. I showed them where it had happened, pointed to the hammer that he had dropped and the wrench still lying on the garage floor. They took my statement, asking questions I could barely answer, and they never found him. The man who had turned a quiet yard sale into a nightmare disappeared as quickly as he had come. And weeks passed, and I kept expecting him to show up again, to finish what he had started. And every time I heard a car pull into the driveway or a knock at the door, my heart leapt in my throat. I stopped holding yard sales, and I stopped leaving the garage door open even for a second. I watched for strangers more closely, my mind replaying the way his eyes had lingered on me, the way his hand had tightened around that hammer. And I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there and that one day he might return. The police told me to stay vigilant, to report anything suspicious, but there was nothing to report. Just an empty driveway and the memory of his shadow stretching across the pavement. The stuff I hadn't sold that day stayed in the garage, just gathering dust, I guess, and I couldn't bring myself to touch it, to move it, or to go near the spot where it had happened. Now, it might sound pathetic, but some nights I dream about him. I see him standing at the edge of the driveway, his hands in his pockets, his eyes fixed on me. And then I wake up drenched in sweat. The yard sale was supposed to be a simple way to clear out the clutter, to make some extra cash, and instead, it left me with a story to send to you that I'll never forget. A scar that's invisible but is always there. I don't know if they'll ever catch him, or if he's still out there looking for his next target. All I know is that I'll never feel safe, truly safe, in my own home again. I still think about Liz, sometimes every day. She loved gardening, and her yard always looked neat, and I would wave to her on Saturday mornings when she was working on her flowers, and she was always smiling. This happened on January 25th, 2019, and that Friday morning was very cold for Houston. I was making coffee when I heard 4 loud pops. I thought it was fireworks at first, but something felt wrong. I looked out the window and saw someone running away from Liz's driveway and getting into a truck, and then the truck sped off. I went outside with my phone ready to call 911, and Liz was there lying on the ground near her driveway, and she wasn't moving. There was a small table and some boxes nearby from the garage sale that she was setting up. Neighbors started coming out of their homes looking confused and worried. The paramedics came quickly and worked on Liz, but it was clear that things were very bad. Later, I found out that she had passed away at the hospital. She was only 29 years old, and I never thought something so awful could happen in our neighborhood. The police said Liz had been shot at close range by someone who walked up to her. A neighbor's security camera caught part of it, and the video showed a person getting out of a black Nissan Frontier, walking up to Liz, shooting her, and driving away. And it all happened in seconds. Liz and her husband Sergio were loved by everyone. They were high school sweethearts and had been married for about 4 years. They loved Star Wars and Harry Potter and went to conventions together. And the garage sale Liz was having that morning was to help pay for a trip to Universal Studios to celebrate their 5th anniversary. And knowing this made her death even sadder. After Liz died, the neighborhood changed drastically. People were sad and scared, and we kept wondering who could have done this. Was it someone she knew? Was it random? The police talked to neighbors and looked at security videos, but they didn't find any answers. They released the video of the suspect in the truck, hoping someone would recognize them, and nobody did. I kept thinking about that morning. Could I have done something to help? Could I have seen more, remembered a license plate? And that guilt stuck with me. I would sit and stare at Liz's house, hoping to see her again, even though I knew that I wouldn't. The empty driveway was a painful reminder of what had happened, and Sergio moved out a few months later, totally understandable. It must have been too hard for him to stay in the house with all of those memories, and that house was sold and new people moved in. They're nice, but to me, it will always be Liz's home. And years have passed, but the case is still unsolved. Sometimes the news will run a story about Liz, hoping to keep her memory alive, and the reward for information has grown, but no one has come forward. And it makes me so angry to know the person who did this is still free out there. I joined a local group that helps with unsolved cases. We hold events, hand out flyers, and try to keep cases like Liz's in the public eye. It's not much, but it feels like I'm doing something. Liz and her family deserve justice. Every year on the anniversary of her death, I leave yellow roses at her driveway, as yellow was her favorite color. Other neighbors do the same, and it's a quiet way to show that we haven't forgotten her. Sometimes at night, I look out my window and wonder if the answer is closer than we think. Did someone see something that they're too scared to tell? Could the killer be nearby? Not knowing has become very hard. Liz's death taught me that life is fragile, that bad things don't always make sense. But it also showed me how people can come together during very tough times. Our neighborhood has changed, and we're more careful to look out for each other even more now. We value small moments like that. I miss Liz. I miss her smile and kindness, and I carry her memory with me and will keep trying to get justice for her. Someone has to. She deserves it. There was a woman in my neighborhood running a yard sale. She was selling some old furniture, clothes, and knickknacks. A few neighbors had stopped by to look around. Our small dog was tied up to a post nearby. That small dog was barking every so often. And down the street there was a larger dog that lived with his owner. And he was a big dog, a mix of some kind, and his owner usually kept him in the backyard or on a leash when they went for walks. But this morning, something went wrong. The gate to the big dog owner's backyard had been left open, and that big dog saw his chance and ran out into the street. At first, that big dog was just exploring. He sniffed around and ran back and forth. And then he noticed the people and the tables up ahead. His tail wagged as he ran toward the closest yard sale, but as he got closer, his energy shifted, and his bark grew louder and more aggressive. His eyes locked on the crowd, and he charged forward. People saw the big dog coming and started to back away, and a little boy dropped the toy that he was holding and screamed as he ran to his mom, but the big dog didn't stop. He jumped onto a table, knocking over a stack of books and smashing a bunch of glass. The lady looked up and shouted, "Get away," but that dog didn't listen. He grabbed a stuffed animal from the table and started tearing it apart. Then the big dog turned his attention to the little dog. And the little dog was barking, the big dog barked back, and then it attacked. The lady screamed and grabbed the little dog just in time, and the big one circled her. She began yelling for help, and the crowd began to scatter. A man who had been browsing a table nearby tried to intervene, yelling and stepping in front of the lady and her dog, and that big dog then attacked the man. The dog sunk his teeth into the man's leg. He yells out in pain and tried to push the dog away, but the dog wouldn't let go. The man fell to the ground trying to kick the big dog, but the dog's strength was too much. People were screaming. One man threw a folding chair at that dog and did nothing. The dog let go of the man's leg and jumped on his chest. The man used his arms to shield his face, and the dog scratched him as he yelled for help. That dog's owner came running down the street shouting at the dog to stop, and it did, and its owner then clipped the leash onto its collar. That bigger dog's owner said that he was sorry. Someone at that point had already called the cops, and someone else began to yell at that dog owner. Paramedics arrived and began treating the man's injuries before loading him into an ambulance, and neighbors stood around talking to one another. The dog's owner apologized again. The yard was a mess with broken glass and scattered items everywhere. Some people helped the lady clean up, and then the street was quiet again. All I know, as a bystander who just sat and watched everything unfold, is that myself nor anyone in the neighborhood will ever forget that day. In 2018, the quiet neighborhoods of Fort Worth, Texas became the hunting grounds for a predator. What should have been ordinary friendly interactions during community garage sales turned into a nightmare as a series of crimes struck fear into unsuspecting homeowners. The media soon dubbed the criminal the Texas garage sale stalker, a name that sent shivers down the spines of those hosting and attending these everyday events. Garage sales are a cherished tradition in many American neighborhoods, and Fort Worth was no exception. Families use these sales to declutter their homes and make extra cash while fostering a sense of community. It was a safe, casual environment where strangers could peruse items and neighbors could connect over shared stories. But in 2018, these gatherings became a fertile ground for a monster, someone who saw the sales not as an opportunity to bargain, but as a chance to prey on the vulnerable. The terror began in March when a woman hosting a garage sale noticed a man lingering longer than most customers. He asked innocuous questions about a piece of furniture but seemed more interested in observing her movements and the layout of her home. Later that evening, as she was packing up unsold items, the man returned, only this time, he was armed. He demanded cash and valuables, forcing his way into her home. Though she survived the encounter physically unharmed, she was deeply shaken. The man escaped before police arrived, who chalked it up to a one-off robbery. However, within weeks, similar incidents began cropping up in nearby neighborhoods. By late spring, a clear pattern had emerged. The attacker targeted women hosting garage sales alone or with minimal help. He struck near the end of the sales when most items were packed away and neighbors had dispersed. Victims described him as a middle-aged man with an average build, wearing unremarkable clothing, a face that would easily blend into a crowd. The attacker used different methods to enter homes. Sometimes he pretended to inquire about items, other times he forced his way inside. Once in, he demanded money and occasionally ransacked the home for valuables, though the robberies didn't always involve physical violence. The psychological toll was immense. Victims were left traumatized, fearing for their safety and the sanctity of their homes. The media caught wind of the crimes by early summer. Headlines warned homeowners to stay vigilant during garage sales, and community forums were flooded with accounts of strange encounters. Residents shared tips on staying safe, such as doing garage sales in pairs or groups and not allowing customers inside their homes for any reason. Despite these precautions, the attacker continued to strike. Police advised the public to report suspicious behavior, but identifying the stalker proved difficult. He avoided security cameras and chose neighborhoods with limited surveillance. His nondescript appearance and tendency to leave quickly made it hard for witnesses to provide detailed descriptions. In July, one victim's quick thinking nearly led to the attacker's capture. A woman hosting a garage sale noticed a man fitting the stalker's description loitering near her driveway. She became suspicious when he lingered without showing much interest in her items. She discreetly alerted a neighbor, who began taking photos of the man from across the street. Sensing he had been spotted, the man left abruptly, abandoning any plans he might have had to strike. The neighbor shared the photos with police, but they were grainy and insufficient for identification. And still, the encounter marked a very strong turning point. The community became determined to stop the stalker, and the stalker's reign of terror came to a head in late August. A woman hosting a garage sale on the outskirts of Fort Worth was attacked after her event ended. This time, the encounter escalated to violence. The attacker struck her with the butt of his gun, leaving her unconscious before fleeing with cash and jewelry. She was found by a neighbor who had heard the commotion and called 911. The brutality of this attack intensified the urgency of the investigation. Police increased patrols in neighborhoods where garage sales were common and set up decoy sales in an attempt to lure the stalker. The community's vigilance also grew, with many canceling their sales altogether or moving them to safer, centralized locations. The breakthrough came in September, when the stalker grew careless. He attempted to rob a garage sale in a neighborhood that had formed a community watch group. Unbeknownst to him, several members were observing the sale from nearby cars, ready to intervene if anything seemed amiss. When he approached the homeowner aggressively, the group sprang into action, blocking his escape route and calling the police. The man tried to flee on foot but was quickly apprehended. He was identified as Mark Eldridge, a 43-year-old drifter with a history of petty theft and burglary. Eldridge had no fixed address, which explained his ability to move undetected between neighborhoods. Police found stolen items in his vehicle, linking him to several of the robberies. Eldridge's arrest brought a sense of relief to Fort Worth, but the scars he left behind were lasting. Many victims struggled with anxiety and fear, and the community's sense of safety was deeply shaken. Garage sales, once a simple and enjoyable tradition, became a reminder of vulnerability. During his trial, Eldridge showed little remorse. He was convicted on multiple accounts of robbery, assault, and burglary and sentenced to 25 years in prison. prosecutors described him as a predator who exploited trust and community spirit for his own gain. The Texas garage sale stalker case highlighted the dangers of seemingly innocent events and the importance of vigilance. Residents of Fort Worth took the lessons to heart, implementing safety measures to protect themselves in the future. These included hosting sales in groups, using visible security cameras, and maintaining constant communication with neighbors. Though the ordeal was traumatic, it also brought the community closer together. Neighbors who had been strangers banded together to support one another, ensuring that no one faced the threat alone. The picturesque town of Dyersburg, Tennessee, nestled along the Mississippi River, is the kind of place where neighbors know each other and life is quiet. But in 2015, the town became the focus of national attention due to the mysterious disappearance and subsequent murder of Karen Swift, a 44-year-old mother of 4. What began as a seemingly ordinary day with a yard sale ended in tragedy, leaving behind a puzzle that remains unsolved to this day. On October 30th, 2015, Karen Swift spent her Saturday hosting a yard sale at her home. A devoted mother, she was known for her vivacious personality and active involvement in the community. The yard sale drew numerous visitors throughout the day as Karen cheerfully interacted with buyers, many of whom were neighbors and acquaintances. For Karen, it was an opportunity to declutter her home and connect with others in her close-knit community. That evening, Karen attended a Halloween party with friends. She returned home late and spoke briefly with her estranged husband, David Swift, who still lived in the family home despite their ongoing divorce proceedings. According to reports, the two had a cordial but strained relationship, sharing the residence to co-parent their children. In the early hours of October 31st, Karen went missing. When Karen's friends and family realized that she had vanished, alarm bells went off. Her car, a white 2004 Nissan Murano, was found abandoned on a rural road just a few miles from her home. The vehicle's tires were flat, and her belongings, including her purse and phone, were left inside. However, there was no sign of Karen herself. Dyer County authorities immediately launched a search. Friends, family, and volunteers combed through nearby wooded areas, fields, and waterways, hoping to find any trace of Karen. Her disappearance struck fear into the hearts of the community, as speculations swirled about what might have happened. Was she abducted by someone that she met at the yard sale? Was her estranged husband involved, or was it the work of a stranger? The case took a devastating turn on December 10, 2015, when Karen's decomposed body was discovered in a wooded area near a cemetery, less than 3 miles from her home. Her remains were concealed under foliage, and the area appeared to have been deliberately chosen to hide her body. An autopsy revealed that she had suffered blunt force trauma to the head. The discovery confirmed what many had feared. Karen Swift had been murdered. However, the identity of her killer remained a mystery, and the investigation into her death became more complex as authorities sifted through a growing list of suspects. Karen's life was undergoing significant changes at the time of her death. She had recently filed for divorce from David Swift, citing irreconcilable differences. Friends described the marriage as troubled, with Karen seeking a fresh start. The divorce proceedings, however, were contentious, and David's behavior came under scrutiny following Karen's disappearance. In addition to her marital struggles, Karen had been involved in local fitness groups and was active on social media. Her outgoing personality and wide circle of acquaintances led investigators to explore whether someone she knew could have harbored ill intentions. One of the more intriguing aspects of the case was the yard sale Karen hosted on the day before her disappearance. A yard sale is a public event attracting strangers to a private residence. Investigators considered the possibility that Karen's killer might have been someone who attended the sale and used it as an opportunity to target her. However, no concrete evidence linked any of the yard sale attendees to the murder. As the investigation progressed, David Swift became a person of interest. Though he publicly denied any involvement, his strained relationship with Karen and his presence at the family home on the night of her disappearance drew suspicion. Friends of Karen claimed that she expressed fear of David in the weeks leading up to her death, and there were rumors of past domestic disputes. And despite these allegations, authorities did not charge David Swift with any crime. He cooperated with the investigation and maintained his innocence, but the cloud of suspicion continued to hang over him. Other theories emerged as well. Some speculated that Karen's killer could have been a stranger who abducted her after her car broke down. Others suggested that she might have been the victim of someone she had met through her social circles or online activity. However, none of those theories produced definitive leads. As months turned into years, the investigation into Karen Swift's murder stalled. Despite the efforts of law enforcement and private investigators, no arrests were made and no new evidence came to light. The lack of witnesses and forensic evidence left the case at a standstill, frustrating Karen's family and friends. The community of Dyersburg remained haunted by Karen's death. Her children, left without their mother, faced the difficult task of moving forward while grappling with unanswered questions surrounding her murder. Karen's friends continued to advocate for justice, organizing memorials and raising awareness about her case in the hopes of keeping it in the public eye. Several key questions remain unanswered. Who killed Karen Swift? Was it someone she knew or a random attacker? Investigators have never publicly identified a suspect or motive. The flat tires on Karen's vehicle suggest that she may have been forced to stop, but it's unclear whether this was staged or coincidental. While there is no evidence tying the yard sale to her murder, the timing raises questions about whether someone who attended the sale might have returned later. And despite extensive efforts by law enforcement, the case remains unsolved, leading to frustration and speculation about investigative missteps or lack of resources. Karen Swift's murder remains one of the most perplexing and tragic cases in Tennessee's recent history. Her family continues to seek answers, holding out hope that new evidence will emerge or that someone with knowledge of the crime will come forward. In the meantime, her case serves as a chilling reminder of how quickly life can change and the enduring pain of unanswered questions. For the residents of Dyersburg, the loss of Karen Swift is a scar that is yet to heal. Her vibrant spirit and love for her children are remembered, even as the search for her killer continues. It was a cold weekend morning when I was walking through the neighborhood with a cup of coffee in my hand, and I noticed a yard sale at this old house. It wasn't much, just a folding table and a few blankets spread out on the grass, but something about it caught my attention. Maybe it was the idea that someone's old stuff might actually hold a hidden gem. An elderly man sat behind the table, and he looked tired but still had a smile on his face. He asked if I was looking for anything in particular, and I shook my head and said no, just sort of scanning through the items. There were old books, porcelain figurines, some vintage lamps, and a box of very tarnished silverware. I picked up an old hardcover book with a faded green cover. As I flipped through its pages, the man spoke again, and he said the book had stories in it, some of them supposedly true. He added that he never could finish it himself because it was actually too spooky. And I just sort of laughed and was about to ask how much he wanted for it when I heard a truck pull up. A black pickup truck stopped and 4 teenagers climbed out. One of them sort of sneered, kicking a garden gnome that was sitting by the sidewalk, and the gnome fell over and actually broke into pieces. At that moment, the elderly man's smile faded. He asked those teenagers to move along if they weren't interested in buying anything. One skinny kid with dark hair and a cruel grin picked up one of the porcelain figures, asked how much it was, and the man told him something like $5 to $10. The teenager just laughed and threw the figurine to the ground, shattering it into pieces. The man asked him not to do that, and he explained that the figurine belonged to his late wife and asked them to have some respect. The skinny kid just grinned again. He shoved the old man's chest, making him stumble back. I wanted to say something, but it was all just like too surreal, you know? and I genuinely was too scared, I'm embarrassed to say. The old man tried to stand his ground. He said he'd called the police and pulled out his phone. That skinny kid grabbed the phone and threw it into the street, and then before anyone could react, he punched the old man, who then fell to the ground. That gang of teens started kicking and hitting him, and the rest of us just stood there, frozen, and all I could do was hold onto that book and watch. Finally, after what felt like a very long time, I heard a siren in the distance. Someone must have called the cops, and those teenagers took off in their truck. The old man lay on the ground. He was bleeding, and a few people slowly went over to help him up. I just stayed where I was, feeling very ashamed. And when the police arrived, they took statements. I handed the book back to the old man, who was sitting on the porch with an ice pack on his swollen face, and he told me just to keep it. That night, I dreamed of that yard sale. This time, the teenagers weren't just breaking things, they were breaking me. And the old man just stood there, smiling, letting it all play out. I had decided to go to some yard sales in the neighborhood, and I wasn't looking for anything specific, just seeing if there was anything interesting. After visiting a few, I was about to go home when I saw an old metal box under a table at one of the sales. I asked the lady in charge of the sale how much she wanted for the box, and she said the box belonged to her uncle and she had no idea what was inside. Then after thinking for a moment, she said that she wanted $5 for it. I gave her the money and carried the box to my car. As I held it, I thought that I felt a slight vibration or sort of hum, but I wasn't sure. I figured it was just my imagination and then drove home, eager to see what was inside. When I opened the box in my kitchen, I saw a small metal ball. It was warm when I touched it. The air felt heavy around it too, and it had a symbol on it that I didn't recognize. Below the ball were some old papers. They were yellowed and had strange equations and diagrams on them. Since I didn't understand any of them, I thought that it might be a good idea to ask someone online about it. I took a picture of the glowing ball and posted it on a forum asking if anyone knew what it was, and I got a lot of replies. Most people joked about it being from aliens or a movie prop, but one comment stood out to me. It said, "Get rid of it. It's radioactive." I felt my stomach drop. I moved away from the box, feeling nervous, and I didn't know what to do next. Should I call someone? But who? Then I got a private message in my inbox. It was from someone who said that they worked in nuclear safety, and the message said, "Don't touch it anymore. Move it to a safe place and let me help you." And I followed their instructions to the letter. I took the box to my garage and put it inside a plastic container, and I stayed as far away from it as I could while moving it. The person messaged me again asking for more details, and they wanted to know the size of the ball, its color, and about the papers. And they explained that warm metal objects can sometimes be radioactive, especially if they're old lab samples or industrial materials, and the person then told me to call the authorities. I was scared, but knew that they were right, and I called the police. They transferred me to a state agency that handles dangerous materials. And about an hour later, a team arrived at my house wearing protective suits and carrying special equipment. The team scanned the ball with a device that made clicking noises, and the clicks got faster the closer they got to the ball. They told me it was radioactive. One of them said that I was lucky that I hadn't kept it in the house for long because it could have possibly made me very sick. And they carefully packed the ball and the papers into a special container that was lined with lead, and then took it away. Later, I found out the police questioned the woman who sold me the box. She said that she had no idea her uncle had anything dangerous. She explained that he had been a chemist many years ago. The radioactive ball was probably something that he had worked on and forgotten about. And the authorities told me that they would investigate further, but I never heard anything else about it. Now, for weeks after this happened, I couldn't stop thinking about it. That glowing ball could have caused serious harm, and at first it seemed like a fun mystery, but it turned out to be very dangerous. I thought about how close I had come to putting myself and others at risk just because I was curious. And I haven't gone to any yard sales since that day. The whole experience has made me very nervous about bringing unknown things into my home. And now whenever I see an interesting object for sale, I think twice. In early 2013, I was working for a large market research company here in New York City. I'd been there 6 years, I was very happy, and my career prospects were bright. And then one day, everything changed. It was a Wednesday morning, and after waking up at 6:15, I completed my morning routine and then walked down to the parking lot of my building. Mine was one of maybe 12 to 14 in the lot, and then, as I'm walking toward it, I saw a lone figure leaning up against the wall near the hood of my car. It seemed to be a young man, early to late 20s, wearing a ball cap and hoodie, and as I walked to my car, the guy just kind of stared at me. I held his gaze, pretty cautious but not confrontational, and then as I got to my car, I asked if I could help him. Again, I wasn't overly confrontational about it, but he was standing by my car and quite obviously staring at me, so I figured I'd better work out what his deal was before I unlocked the door. I asked him, "Can I help you?" And then without skipping a beat, he replied, "Can't nobody help you, homie." I figured he was just trying to be a smart ass, so I decided not to engage him any further. Just got into my car and then started backing up out of my parking space. But then as I did, and the whole time, hoodie guy is just sort of staring at me, grinning from ear to ear like his little "can't nobody help you, homie" thing was the dunk of all dunks. And on the drive to work, I got cut off or flipped off maybe a dozen times, all in the space of 30 minutes. And then by the time one of my boss's pain-in-the-ass midweek meetings were finished, I had practically forgotten all about that hoodie guy and his very nonsensical quip. And I went about my day as usual, which was actually a pretty busy one too, so it wasn't until late in the afternoon that the encounter popped into my head again. Assuming the guy was there to steal a car, or maybe pull a smash and grab to score some valuables, somebody in my apartment building was about to have a really bad day. But little did I know, even though my car was safely in the employee parking lot, it was still me that was about to have that really bad day. And so, the working day ends, I drive back home, and as I'm pulling into the parking lot, I'm not seeing any broken windows or broken glass in my empty parking spaces, so I figured that we got off lucky. But then, after I walked upstairs to the floor my apartment was on, I turned a corner on my corridor, and I see it. Or more accurately, I smell it. Someone had pooped all over my door. Not like a regular poop either. I'm talking like liquid diarrhea from the spray pattern, and it looked like it had hit my door with considerable force. And I remember just staring at it for a second, in complete disbelief, thinking, please God, no. This can't be freaking happening right now. And then when the smell hit my nostrils, I had to cover up my nose and mouth to keep from gagging. I walked right back down to my car, called an emergency cleaning company, and then called block management to get me copies of the building's security camera footage. All our main doorways and corridors had cameras, which was half the reason I'd chosen to rent there in the first place. And so the process of contacting management and obtaining copies of that day's footage was a quick and very easy one. After getting those emergency cleaners over and tipping them pretty well for how short notice the job was, I was able to get into my apartment probably by around 9:30. I made some coffee, sat down on my laptop, and just started sifting through the footage that block management had placed in an online Dropbox for me. Now, it took me a while to get to the right section of that footage, but sometime in the early afternoon, some hooded figure approached my apartment building's main entrance. This guy was also wearing a hoodie and ball cap combo, but unlike the guy in the parking lot that morning, this guy was also wearing a hoodie and ball cap combo, but unlike the guy in the parking lot that morning, this one appeared to be wearing a fluorescent vest while carrying a package. Now, assuming that he was a delivery guy, I figured that he was going to walk to an apartment, deliver the package, and then turn around and leave. But he didn't. Instead, he walked up to my apartment, put the package down, and then dropped his pants, and as you know, browned all over my door. When he finished, he didn't even wipe. He just pulled his pants back up and then walked out of the building so calmly that it was almost like it were an everyday thing for this guy. And I could barely believe what I was seeing. But there it was, clear as day, and maybe the weirdest thing to me at the time was, it wasn't even the same hoodie and ball cap guy that I'd seen that morning. Or at least I was 90% sure that it wasn't. He was too tall, too broad, and although I had a massive hunch that the two people were connected, I had zero clues as to why they were targeting me. I called the cops, but they were no help whatsoever, and even suggested that I try and rule out the possibility that it was a friend of mine pulling some kind of prank. And after I very politely explained that I didn't have any friends that would poop on my door, they said that they'd be in touch if there were any developments, and kind of laughed. But it was me who called them back the very next morning. I woke up at 6:15, completed my morning routine, and then walked down to the parking lot to find my car had been near destroyed in the middle of the night. I called work, told my boss what had happened, and he very kindly gave me the day off so I could talk to the cops and arrange alternative transportation. Now, when I called the cops, I spoke to a different department about my car getting trashed, but they seemed just as useless as the first time that I called. They said that they'd review all the security camera footage I could provide, but since all the hooded perps' faces were covered, I knew that there wasn't much that they'd be able to do with it. And I only barely found the motivation to email it over to the address they provided, and then by early evening, I was starting to have some very worrying thoughts. Since I was obviously being targeted at home, it seemed foolish to continue staying in my apartment. And so after my car got towed away for repair, I found a decent-looking 3-star hotel that had some vacancies nearby and then took a taxi there to make a booking. I called my dad from the hotel room just to ask his advice and whatnot, and he agreed that it was very concerning that his group of people seemed to know where I lived. It was one thing for some a-hole to target my car after seeing me drive it, but it was another for this hooded pooper to know exactly which door to do his business on. There was also a clear pattern of escalation, so logically speaking, the next thing that they were going to do was attempt to attack me in my apartment, which, as it turns out, is exactly what they tried to do. I had no idea who they were, and technically I still don't know, but at the time, it made the whole thing doubly frightening and confusing for me. Like, how in the hell had such a conflict suddenly started over a staring contest and a brief exchange of words? And who the hell were the guys targeting me? Were they a gang or something? Were they brothers, cousins, maybe even just friends, and I just so happened to have messed with the crazy one? And besides all of that, how far were these guys willing to take this? Well, apparently as far as breaking into my apartment and smashing the entire place to smithereens. So remember how I mentioned booking that hotel room? Well, I decided if I was going to stay there for a week or more, then I was going to hit up my apartment to take care of a few things and then grab a few home comforts to take back to my hotel. And after work, I took a cab back to my apartment, walked upstairs, then what do you know? My apartment door is hanging off of its hinges, and one of my neighbors is just sort of standing there, looking like he's seen a ghost. When I walk inside, I understand why. Whoever broke into my apartment had trashed the entire place. The glass in my shower was smashed, they destroyed my bed frame, and then the TV room and kitchenette were both carpeted with chunks of glass and porcelain from where they'd been doing Chappie impressions with the contents of my cabinets. That's a terrible baseball reference, by the way. They'd torn up all the art that had been on my walls, my TV and laptop had been obliterated, but by far the worst and most hurtful thing, they smashed my fish tank, and they killed all my fish. I was devastated. Genuinely and soul-shatteringly devastated. To F with me and my stuff? Whatever, man. But to dry drown my fish like that, to hurt innocent little creatures, just living their happy little SeaWorld lives. It took everything I had not to just have a total breakdown in front of my neighbor. Now cut to about an hour later from that, I'm back in my hotel room and I'm faced with two very cold hard facts. Firstly, I was going to have to call the cops for the third time in as many days, and secondly, I had no choice but to find another place to live. But still, the thread that ran through all 3 days and the thing that had me practically tearing my own teeth out in frustration was obviously why. It didn't make any sense, not anymore. Some psycho trashing my car and pooping on my door because we had a minor confrontation, there was a sort of perverse logic to that, especially if there was some homeless guy on drugs. But I was just left there asking myself, if I was home that night, would they have killed me? And how had things managed to escalate to the point that in just 3 days, all of this from a minor confrontation? It was like a nightmare, one I'd have done anything to wake up from, but it wasn't over just yet, not by a long shot. First off, when I got the security camera footage from block management, who by this point were not happy with all the trouble I was bringing home, I saw that it was the usual suspects, so to speak. Instead of a group of hooded hoodlums bursting into my apartment, similar to the group that had trashed my car, these guys looked different. They were wearing all black, with face masks and gloves. They looked like pros. It was almost terrifying. And that's the point that I decided that I was never going to lay my head there ever again, and I started looking for new places to live. But then a few days later, there was another serious escalation. One that made me realize that finding a new place to live might not solve anything at all. Now, I'd taken to riding the metro to and from Grand Central, but that meant walking several blocks from the station to our office building. Now, I actually didn't mind all that much. It gave me a chance to get a bite to eat after work, and the metro seemed considerably more civilized than the subway. And then, coupled with the peace of mind it gave me, knowing that I wasn't headed anywhere I could be targeted, it made for quite a nice change of pace. But then one day, as I'm turning from Park Avenue onto East 47th, I hear someone call my name. I was just walking along, eating my little box of halal cart street meats and fries, and I hear someone yell my name in a way that suggested that they were glad to see me. And that's the only reason I turned around in the first place. If they'd sounded mad or literally anything but as happy as they sounded, I'd have kept my eyes forward and picked up the pace in the hopes of losing them in the crowd. But they didn't sound mad. They sounded almost excited, so I turned, expecting to see an old friend or old coworker or something. But instead, I see a total stranger, and the stranger jogs up to me and just sort of goes, boom, and punches me square in the face. I fall backwards. My street meats go tumbling all over me, and the stranger goes running off, still shouting my name, but also adding stuff like, "You suck, dude, you suck." Now, it being New York, only 3 of the maybe 24 people who saw me get decked were like, "Oh damn, you okay, buddy?" and walked over to see if I was okay. And needless to say, I was not. At that point, I had had a few days of nothing happening. I had a ton of crap to deal with in terms of getting my car roadworthy again and finding a new place to live, and I still had the mystery of the whole thing bearing down on me. But there was this short period where I thought that the worst had come and gone. Something weird and effed up was going on, but once they figured out where I lived, finding me was a piece of cake, I guess. But after the punch, I realized they, whoever they were somehow able to track me during my commute. Realizing that I wasn't safe anywhere, possibly not even in my own goddamned hotel room, this took everything to a whole nother level of stress and fear for me. And it might sound pathetic to some, so might as well say it like it is, but I literally wanted to run home to my mommy and daddy. I just didn't know where else to turn to, because the police had only just started to take things seriously, and by that point I was obviously in way over my head and in serious danger. But the real dilemma was knowing that if I did head home to my parents' place, I might potentially leave my attackers there and put my parents at risk too. I couldn't even tell them how bad it had gotten by then because I knew they'd insist on intervening in some way, which again might put them at risk. I had the cops, and I had my boss because once they understood how serious the situation was, my employers were very understanding and basically put me on indefinite paid leave until the whole situation could be rectified. And so between the cops, my bosses, my coworkers, my soon-to-be ex-landlords, and my prospective new landlords, my phone was very active. I spent long periods of time returning phone calls and responding to text messages, and I became very accustomed to seeing my screen light up with unknown and withheld phone numbers. A few nights later, I was in a different hotel room when my phone starts buzzing on the desk with "number private" written on the screen. I didn't hesitate for a second. I swiped the call open, brought my phone to my ear, and was greeted by someone very well spoken and confident who had a very deep voice. When the guy used my name, I figured it was either a cop or someone responding to a tenancy application that I'd filled out. Yet slowly but surely, I realized that call was from someone very different. He knew a lot about me, and he appeared to use the information to confirm it was actually me he was talking to. He used my name, named my employer. He even knew the address of my old apartment, the one I was planning on moving out of. I only answered one or two of his questions before I politely asked why he was calling, and that's when he introduced himself with the name Odin. Odin, which he made clear was not his real name, worked for some tech company out west, and the reason he was calling was that he had found some of my personal information on the internet. And at first, it was sort of like, okay, so what? Because I figured he was talking about my social media or the email address and phone number listed on my employer's website. But that's not what Odin was referring to. He said my name, my old address, photos of me, and even things like my employment history were all available to read on a website he called Doxbin. And that name meant nothing to me at the time. I wasn't even sure exactly what he said, but these days, I still get a shudder when I read it or hear it spoken. For those that don't know, Doxbin was, or is, I heard it was back but I can't say for certain, a website that you can't access via your regular internet browser. It's located on what some people call the dark web, but Odin said it's more like the deep web, and from what I understand, all you really need is a special browser and you can see all the stuff you can't see on Chrome or Internet Explorer. Odin said that I could see for myself if I wanted to follow his instructions on how to download and install that special kind of browser. But after I agreed that it'd just be faster to send me the screenshots, he did that, and I saw for myself what was written on that website. Someone, I had no idea who at this stage, had not only listed all my personal information, they also claimed that I had several convictions involving inappropriate activities with children. The post essentially said that I was masquerading as my actual self, because I was some diddler trying to relocate and make a new life for myself after charges were filed in Ohio and Illinois. And that's when it all clicked. The random guy trying to intimidate me, people pooping on my door, smashing my car, and punching me in the face, all related to that initial confrontation. It's just that initial confrontation came as a result of this wild online accusation from what I thought was a completely anonymous source. But it wasn't anonymous, not completely anyway. And not only had Odin used his computer wizardry to figure out who the post was from, but he seemed more than happy to share what he'd learned. And now from what I understand, the dark or deep web is mostly only accessible through anonymous browsers, and the vast majority of posts on Doxbin were from anonymous users. But Odin figured he'd do a little digging to find out who I'd pissed off so much that they'd want to ruin my life. He Googles my name, but nothing really came up, so he checks out the charges and finds the whole Doxbin post is just some elaborate lie. Odin then circles back to trying to figure out who's mad at me and ends up searching for people who have recently separated from the research company I worked for. He finds one guy who looks like he knows his way around a Tor browser, a real takes one to know one kind of deal. He then discovers his kindred spirit has a blog on the surface web, something he can peruse at his leisure. And that's when he realizes that the writing styles of his posts and the one on Doxbin revealing my info are almost identical. Odin explained all that for about a minute or two before I practically begged him to tell me the name of the suspect. And then when he told me, It was like this sort of holy crap moment where everything suddenly came together and started making sense. I don't want to say the guy's name. I'd rather take the high ground and not dox the doxer, so to speak, but I immediately recognized it from a review I'd conducted, which had just so happened to contribute to this guy's severance from the company. He was lazy, unkempt, rarely showed up on time, and barely got his work done. But apparently beneath the greasy surface, our boy was as skilled with a computer as he was vindictive. And then when he got wind that it was me that conducted his review, well, my fate was sealed. I remember sitting on the hotel bed, my phone in one hand, head in the other, massaging my temples between my thumb and ring finger, trying to stave off the incoming migraine. I think it was a case of too much information all at once, as well as swinging back and forth between thinking the call was just another prank and believing Odin was genuine. But I think by the time he dropped the name of the guy who got fired, I figured Odin knew way too much about everything for it to be a ruse. He was also willing to share everything except his identity, so unless it was all some elaborate scam, he seemed to be genuinely on my side. But here's the part where the paranoia returned with a vengeance, because towards the end of the call, Odin asked for money. He claimed he'd be able to take down the post about me. But since it was a time-critical situation, in that the longer it stayed up, the longer I'd be at risk, he'd need help breaking into the website so he could get the job done. And that meant asking some friends if they'd help him out, and those friends would require financial compensation for their efforts. Basically, if I transferred Odin a few $1,000s in Bitcoin, he could make the whole thing go away. And right away, alarm bells started going off in my head. I actually asked him straight up if it was him that had posted my info as a sort of roundabout way of blackmailing me into taking it down. And then he sort of laughed nervously and then admitted that did have a certain devious genius to it, but if all he really wanted was money, there were 100 ways he could scam or extort me, all without having to take the time to call and explain this whole terrible situation. And that's another thing that convinced me that he was legitimate. I'm well aware that he might have been playing the long game, and that maybe the deception was, I don't know, all part of the game for him. But whoever Odin was, he made me an offer I couldn't refuse. An offer that was in such good faith that he offered to take the post down prior to asking for payment. He didn't need to inform me of what he was capable of doing should I choose not to pay him, and I had a pretty good idea from experience, so I did. But not after 10 whole days went by without incident. He checked in every day, sort of as a reminder that I owed him, but also just to make sure nothing else had happened. He said that there was every chance my old apartment might be targeted again, but only by guys who already knew where I lived and still believed I was some kind of child predator. But with the post taken down, there hopefully wouldn't be anyone else planning on teaching me a lesson, or however the guy's post phrased it. But I was skeptical. I mean, there was still that voice in the back of my mind saying, "You just got scammed." But as the days went by and there were no further incidents at my old apartment building, that voice got quieter and quieter before being silenced completely. On the 10th day, I converted Odin's money into Bitcoin and finally sent it over to his wallet in this very complex process. And he then called me to offer a brief word of thanks, but the call ended with me thanking him, and pretty profusely too. And as it happened to be so, when we ended the call, I decided to call him back just a few minutes later to ask if I could ever enlist his services again should I require them. And no sooner had I hit dial that I heard this dull-toned but. The number had been disconnected. A few days went by, and the more I thought about this whole mess, the more that creeping sense of paranoia started to return. I became more and more convinced that Odin had been the one responsible for the whole ordeal, at least until I realized that there was a way I could kind of verify if what he'd told me was true or not. I called in a favor with one of the ladies in HR, then one afternoon while I was still staying in that hotel room, I dialed a number that I had written on a piece of paper and hit call. Seconds later, I heard a voice on the other end of the phone. It was the guy whose review I'd conducted, the one who ended up getting fired as a result, and after putting on the cheeriest voice possible, I began to speak. I told him who it was, told him I'd learned of his severance, and then told him how sorry I was to hear about it. He sounded surprised but not scared, so I just kind of carried on. I told him that I'd heard about a potential opportunity at another company and asked if he'd like me to keep him informed of any vacancies. Again, he sounded confused, but he told me sure, and that he'd like that. I ended the call by saying how good it was to hear from him again. It was all a lie, but one I wanted to gauge his reaction with. I wanted to hear the hatred in his voice. I wanted anything to confirm that he'd been motivated to try and ruin my entire life. But the thing that got him was this. Right as I was about to hang up and we were trapped in that meandering exchange of thanks for calling and talk to you soon maybe, I told him, I know what you did. I believe an innocent person would have at the very minimum replied with something sort of like, huh? Did what? But he didn't say a single goddamned word. And for a brief moment, it sounded like he was going to say something, like he was thinking or deciding on some killer comeback to zing me, but he didn't. He just hung up. And that was all I needed. Odin hadn't been lying to me, or if he was in cahoots with the guy who posted that, and then I got to take my hat off to just a well-laid-out scam. But something about the way the guy said nothing, it was almost like he knew he was being recorded, or you can bet your bottom dollar that I filmed the whole thing using my laptop camera, just on the off chance that I'd forced an admission. He knew that he couldn't prove anything, not if he kept his mouth shut and didn't gloat about it, so in the end, I guess he got away with it. But I got what I wanted. What seemed more important than anything else by that stage was peace of mind. I saw the cause and effect clear as day, and though it made for one hell of a ride, I could finally make some sense of what had been happening to me. I don't live in New York anymore. I don't even live on the East Coast, and nor do I still work in market research. And I'm happy, I'll say that much. But at this stage, I'm far too jaded to post anything too revealing in online spaces. And to anyone who reads this, I implore you, be very careful regarding what personal information you allow to be posted online, because there are some deeply disturbed people out there who will jump at the chance to use it against you. I first became interested in the dark web during my second year of university. I was taking a module on cybersecurity when the subject came up during a seminar, and it seemed like this mysterious, almost mythical corner of the internet that few people truly understood. I read articles and watched videos about it, some sensationalized, others more technical, and I was fascinated by the idea of this vast hidden network lying just beneath the surface. I won't lie, I was curious regarding the darker side of things, but it wasn't where my interests were rooted. I wanted to understand the technology, the architecture, as well as what purpose it might have in the online landscape of tomorrow. Accessing it turned out to be easier than I'd imagined. I downloaded the Tor browser, which is designed to anonymize your online activity by routing traffic through a series of volunteer-operated servers. And then to be extra cautious, I used a VPN for another layer of security. Navigating the dark web wasn't like using Google, where everything is indexed and easy to find. Instead, you have to use directories like the Hidden Wiki to locate onion sites. And to learn how to do that, I joined forums to learn the ropes from people who had been exploring the dark web for years. And once I was ready, I began exploring. At first, my discoveries were at best surprisingly harmless and sometimes wholesome, and at worst, only mildly unsettling. I found a lot of resources dedicated to online privacy, such as guides on using encrypted messaging apps or secure email platforms, and advice on avoiding surveillance. These weren't tools for criminals either. A big portion of the market seemed to be people like journalists and activists in countries with oppressive governments, which was a very cool aspect that hadn't even occurred to me until that point. But then a lot of users seemed to just be regular people who appeared to greatly value their digital privacy. But while some people simply trying to get ahead in a changing world of online activity, others exhibited decidedly unhealthy tendencies. For example, there was a small contingent of users who believed that they were the victims of what's called gang stalking. Gang stalking refers to the belief that a person is being systematically harassed by a coordinated group. They often describe constant surveillance, sabotage, social isolation, and public intimidation orchestrated by strangers, acquaintances, or even authorities like the federal government. It's true that a handful of isolated cases of organized harassment have been recorded, but what's important to keep in mind is that most reports of gang stalking lack any kind of evidence whatsoever and can often be caused by things like paranoia, anxiety, and other serious psychiatric conditions. The level of paranoia sufferers experience causes them to misinterpret ordinary events as deliberate threats, which can sometimes have devastating results for their friends and families. And some of what I saw unfolding on the gang stalking forum was as disheartening as it was disturbing. People's entire lives had fallen to pieces, but instead of accepting help from family or friends, they turned inward, formed secretive online communities, and actively encouraged each other's delusions. And sometimes it appeared to have deadly consequences. For me, exploring the dark web started as an academic curiosity, but quickly became something deeper. It made me think more critically about privacy, surveillance, and how technology shapes our freedoms. The dark web didn't seem inherently good or bad. It was just a tool, and what seemed to matter most was the intent of those who used it. But as I spent more time exploring, I inevitably began to come across things that hinted at its darker side. It was gradual, almost like peeling back layers of something you're not entirely sure you want to see. There were mentions of marketplaces where illegal goods were traded, forums where people discussed activities that were clearly unethical or overtly criminal. And these weren't things that I actively sought out. They were just there, scattered amidst the harmless content. But it was the rumors of so-called red rooms that marked my first tentative steps into the deep web's darkest recesses. These were said to be live-streamed events where unspeakable acts were performed on camera for an audience willing to pay in cryptocurrency. Some claimed that they were the stuff of urban legend, exaggerated or entirely fabricated to add to the dark web's infamy. Others spoke about them with eerie detail, describing how you'd need to find hidden links and pay a steep price for access. Even though I hadn't yet seen anything that confirmed their existence, the very idea was chilling. But what really struck me about the darker corners of the deep web were how casually some people discussed such topics. In certain forums, people discussed things that were morally repugnant as if they were just innocent curiosities. It felt like stepping into a world where societal norms had been stripped away and anonymity had created a space where anything, no matter how horrifying, could flourish. Despite the darkness, I kept reminding myself why I was there in the first place, to understand, not to engage. I was careful to avoid clicking on anything suspicious or venturing too far into places I didn't belong. Still, it was impossible not to feel the weight of what the dark web could be. For every encrypted email service or activist forum, there seemed to be an equally sinister counterpart lurking in the shadows. The rumors of so-called red rooms lingered in the back of my mind as I continued exploring. They were whispered about in forums and chat rooms, yet always elusive and always unconfirmed. And at first I too dismissed them as nothing but digital urban legends, nothing but the product of overactive imaginations. But the more I read, the more I started to realize they weren't entirely the stuff of myth. It felt like an unsettling puzzle, one I wasn't sure I wanted to solve, but I couldn't resist trying to uncover the truth. My search began with forums where users claimed to have insider knowledge. The posts were cryptic, filled with vague hints and coded language. Some people described red rooms as pay-to-view live-stream services where horrific acts were performed on camera, often at the request of an audience. Others dismissed the idea as impossible, pointing out the technical difficulties of streaming live video anonymously through Tor. However, There were enough detailed accounts to keep me intrigued, enough to make me wonder if some twisted corner of the internet had found a way to make it real. I followed the leads cautiously, moving through layers of forums, chat rooms, and directories, but the deeper I went, the more the atmosphere seemed to change. Places felt heavier, darker even, and I came across sites with names that felt like warnings, their plain black and white pages filled with ominous links. Some required passwords or cryptocurrency to proceed, and I hesitated. I didn't want to cross a line that I couldn't uncross, but part of me was driven by a need to know. Were these simply dead ends, or were they actually the real McCoy? And the most unnerving moments came when I found threads where people claimed to have attended those supposed events. They spoke about encrypted invitations, exorbitant Bitcoin payments, and fleeting access to streams hosted on obscure servers. It was all so surreal, yet the way they described it felt disturbingly plausible. I never found anything definitive, no actual links, no concrete evidence, but the process alone was chilling. The deeper I dug, the more I realized that even the search itself carried risks, not just of stumbling upon something horrific, but of crossing a boundary that I wasn't willing to cross. Whether or not red rooms actually exist almost seemed irrelevant toward the end, because the pursuit alone had revealed an incredibly unsettling truth about what people are capable of imagining. I logged off, shaken by the experience, but also strangely relieved that I hadn't found what I was looking for. The rumors remained just that, rumors. But the darkness I glimpsed along the way felt all too real. And in the end, it was that feeling of being so close to finding something that dragged me back down that rabbit hole. I still remember the moment I found it. It was the culmination of weeks of following cryptic threads, chasing rumors, and piecing together fragments of a puzzle that I wasn't even sure I wanted to solve. It came unexpectedly, after hours of trawling through hidden forums and dead links. A new thread had appeared in one of the darker corners of a forum posted by someone who claimed to have access to a real red room. And the post was sparse, just a brief description, a heavily encrypted link, and a demand for payment in Bitcoin. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, to close the browser and walk away, but I couldn't. The curiosity that had driven me this far refused to let me quit. I transferred the required Bitcoin, an amount that made my chest tighten as I watched it leave my wallet and follow the instructions. The link took me to a blank page with a countdown timer. It felt surreal, like stepping into the setup of some macabre horror film. I waited, my heart rate beginning to quicken as I questioned every decision which led me to that moment. When the countdown hit 0, the screen flickered, and a grainy video feed appeared. The room was very stark and clinical, lit by harsh fluorescent lights that cast sharp shadows on the walls. A man in a lab coat stood in the center, surrounded by equipment that looked cobbled together, medical monitors, steel tables, and tools whose purposes I didn't want to imagine. The camera panned slowly, revealing a figure strapped to one of the tables. They were conscious, but their face was contorted with fear and their muffled cries were audible even through their gag and the poor audio quality. The chat panel beside the video feed erupted with activity. Anonymous viewers typed messages, some urging the host to proceed, others asking for specific acts or experiments. It was horrifying, not just because of what I was seeing, but because of the casualness of the audience. They treated it like a spectacle, something to be ordered and consumed, as if the person on the table wasn't even a human being to begin with. I don't know if they believed it was fake or something, and that's why they were able to talk that way, but to me, it looked very real. The experiments began, and I could barely stomach it. The host used injections, electrical currents, and other devices that seemed designed to test pain thresholds or biological responses. The victim writhed and screamed, their agony evident through the screen, and the audience cheered, their requests growing more depraved with every passing moment. And it was unlike anything I'd ever imagined. Pure, unfiltered cruelty masquerading as scientific inquiry. I don't know how long I watched before I forced myself to close the browser and slam closed my laptop. I sat there in silence, feeling sick. My hands trembled, and I felt an overwhelming sense of guilt for even having gone that far. The reality of what I'd seen was far worse than any rumor or legend. It wasn't just a myth. This was real, and it was happening somewhere, hidden in the depths of this shadowy network. That night I deleted everything. The Tor browser, my Bitcoin wallet, the logs I kept of my search. I wanted no trace of what I'd done, no connection to the sickening, skin-crawling world that I had taken a glimpse into. But those images stayed with me. They're things I'll never fully forget, as long as I live, and I suppose that's something that I have to deal with, alone. The dark web is a grim place, a pit where humanity's worst instincts thrive, and it's where I work. I'm what's known as a white hat, a kind of good guy hacker paid to tear down vile markets, map the trails that lead to the monsters hiding in the shadows, and shine a sort of light into that darkness. Most days I sit in front of my screens, the glow of my monitors the only light in my small, cluttered apartment as my fingers fly over the keyboard, piercing layers of encrypted filth and exposing secrets no one else dares to look for. It's my job, and it's not for the faint of heart, but I'm goddamn good at it. I've seen horrors beyond imagination, things no one should ever witness, but the case that haunts me started on a day like any other. A routine sweep led to a marketplace buried deep in the web's underbelly. It advertised human lives as commodities, young and old, with glossy images and cold descriptions. I'd seen it before, but this one had a different aura. Polished, professional, and insidiously quiet. A digital fortress, almost daring anyone to try to break in. I remember digging into its code and unraveling the layers of security, sort of like peeling an onion. It was very slow and grueling and frustrating work, and the site had a grotesque elegance to it, its defenses crafted by someone who knew what they were doing. But no system is impenetrable, and by the end of the third day I was in. The database was rather vast, with entries detailing victims, names, ages, photos, and chillingly precise descriptions of their usefulness. Each profile was a silent scream, a plea buried in ones and zeros, and I started extracting the data, piecing together patterns and names and connections, and as always, I logged everything meticulously, building a dossier that might help the authorities when I was done dismantling the site. Then I found her, a girl from the Philippines, and she couldn't have been more than 12. Her photo showed a child with wide, frightened eyes and a forced smile. Her profile was detailed in a way that made my stomach churn. And something about her entry stood out, though. An odd note in the metadata, a small breadcrumb someone had left behind. It was a payment log, and it didn't lead to a buyer. It led back to her family. I ran her name through every database I had access to, cross-referencing missing persons reports, social media posts, and news articles. And the trail was faint, but it was there. She disappeared months ago, her last known sighting in a small village. The local news barely mentioned it, and her parents never reported her missing. Instead, their lives had taken a very curious turn. I found pictures of them on Facebook, standing in front of a newly built house. Posts bragging about a blessing that had come their way. Expensive clothes, lavish parties, smiles plastered across their faces. It just didn't add up. Where does a poor family suddenly get that kind of money? The pieces clicked together, a grotesque puzzle I wish that I hadn't solved. They sold her. Their own flesh and blood, handed over to monsters for a better life. I stared at the screen, bile rising up in my throat ready to vomit, and it wasn't just the marketplace. It was the betrayal, the abandonment, the cold calculations that turned a child into currency. I've always kept my work professional, very detached, but this time I couldn't stop thinking about her. She wasn't just a name in a database anymore. She was a girl who had been discarded like trash, her life ripped apart by the people who were supposed to love her most. I dug deeper into her family. Bank records, private messages, anything I could find. Every transaction told a story, and the trail was very damning. The deposit that coincided with her disappearance, the gradual splurge on luxuries, they weren't just complicit, they were thriving off her suffering. The more I uncovered, the more I felt anger creeping in. My work had always been about dismantling systems, not judging individuals, but this felt very personal. Her image haunted me, that forced smile and the terror in her eyes. I just couldn't shake it no matter how hard I tried. I'd been compiling evidence for weeks, building a case that would hold up under scrutiny, and the authorities would take it from there, and that's how it always worked. But with each passing day, the thought of her family living in comfort while she suffered gnawed at me. They'd bought their happiness with her life. It was just monstrous. One night, as I sifted through the last of the data, I made a decision. I wouldn't just hand over the evidence and walk away. I would make them feel the weight of what they'd done. They couldn't be allowed to forget her, to erase her like she was nothing. I crafted an email, anonymous and untraceable, attaching photos of their daughter from the marketplace, blurred enough to protect her dignity, but unmistakable. I sent it to them with no words, just images. I wanted them to see her, to remember what they'd done. I'll never know if they opened it, but I imagined the guilt festering inside them like a rot. It wasn't justice, but it was something. The marketplace was gone within days, wiped clean from the dark web. My work there was done, and the authorities had the evidence they needed to start tracking that network. But her face has stayed with me, a ghost that I couldn't exorcise. I like to think that she's still alive somewhere, that the system I helped dismantle gave her a chance at freedom. But I know better. The dark web doesn't just let go of its victims easily. Still, I keep working, tearing down one monster at a time, because if I don't, who will? Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon. My name is Ruslan, and I'm almost 60 years old, living in Brighton Beach here in Brooklyn. Now, I listen to your podcast a lot when I drive my cab, which is all I do, all day, every day pretty much, just driving my cab. But things never used to be this way. You see, I emigrated to the United States in 1992, a short while after my country disappeared overnight. But before that, I was a forest ranger in central Russia, where Europe meets Asia, in a place called Yugidva. Now, the Yugidva National Park is spread across the western slopes of Russia's Ural Mountains, which was about 1,600 kilometers east of Moscow. Now, there is a tundra at the highest elevations, while meadows cover the lower. But more than half of the park is covered in boreal forest of pine and spruce. At almost 19,000 square kilometers, it is a very big place. And to put that into perspective for you, the entire landmass of Kuwait is only 17,000 square kilometers, meaning the park is even bigger than some entire countries. Seeing as it's in quite a remote location, there are other parks with much easier reach of Moscow and St. Petersburg. The park received relatively low levels of tourism, with only a few thousand people visiting each year. Seeing as it's in quite a remote location, there are other parks with much easier reach of Moscow and St. Petersburg, and the park received relatively low levels of tourism, with only a few thousand people visiting each year. Now, back when I worked there, those visitors were often the families of Red Army soldiers stationed at nearby bases, as it was an encounter with one such soldier in 1987 that marked the beginning of the events that I'm about to share with you. My official title while working for the park was Lishnik, which loosely translates to forester. Now, we don't have rangers, and I find this a very American concept. We were not offered fancy titles under socialism, and we did not require them to do our jobs. We were foresters, one and all, and that's what I responded to when I heard it barked at me from down a trail one day. It was high summer, the busiest time of the year in terms of tourism, and I was walking along a woodland trail when I suddenly heard someone shouting from behind me. "You there, forester, come here now." Now, in that moment, I turned to see a man out of uniform, but I could tell just from the way he addressed me that he was an officer in the Red Army. I had served a few years in the Army myself when I was a much younger man, enough to know its officers shared the same collective personality, that which my American neighbors called jerk-offs. I like this word, and it almost sounds like a Russian word. And as he marched towards me, quick and angry, I turned to face him. Now, behind him stood his family, a wife and 2 young children, a boy and a girl. But unlike the officer, who appeared furious, all 3 of his family looked very shaken, like they had seen something which frightened them deeply. Now, when I asked the officer what the problem was, he exploded. He told me some strange person was wandering around the forest, and that this man had deliberately set about to intimidate his wife and children as they sat down for a picnic. I asked for a description of the man, and the officer described him as being tall, dressed in dark furs, and wearing a hat that appeared to have been made from a bear's head. Now, at first, he didn't outwardly threaten the family. He just simply watched them from a distance and opted for a silent staring contest when challenged by the officer. But then, when the officer took a few steps in his direction, the man wearing the bear's head began to charge at them. The officer said his children began to scream, and he believed he was going to have to fight the man to protect them. Yet just in the style of the beast which sat atop his head, it was a false charge, and after having scared the officer's wife so terribly that she was crying, he stopped and then walked off laughing at the terror he'd sown. Now, to me, it sounded like a hunter who drunk too much vodka, but when I suggested that, the officer made it clear that the man was no hunter. He carried no visible weapon. All he had was madness in his eyes. Now, he also suggested that I find him and fast, because if the man wasn't apprehended by the end of the following week, there'd be hell to pay. So later that day, myself and one of my fellow foresters got to work trying to find the so-called crazy man who wore a bear's head for a hat. Now, we had an old UAZ 469 back at Central Headquarters, one which we nicknamed the Goat. It was loud, the brakes were lousy, and riding in it for long distances put bruises on your butt. So, not necessarily the greatest of all time, like my friend's kid says about the Dagestani fighter. The Goat wasn't gentle, but it was reliable, and it was easy to repair. And then with so much ground to cover to do our jobs, we loved it like the Huns loved their horses. We drove out to where the officer had spotted the man wearing the bear's head, and then we went walking around the woods for hours, looking for tracks or leftovers from campfires or animal butchery. Now, the park used to get a great deal of illegal hunting, especially during the autumn months, which certain poorer families wanted to stock up their larders for the long Russian winters that I do not miss. And since the park was so big, these hunters sometimes spent days at a time living off the land while tracking down larger animals to bring home. All that activity makes them easy to track. But to our surprise, and aside from a few useless tracks that led into streams or onto hard ground, there was no sign of the bear man anywhere. Now, we decided to finish our search as sunset was fast approaching, but since I most definitely believed the officer when he said he'd bring trouble for us if we didn't find him, we just resumed our search for the bear man the next morning, bright and early at dawn. Now, myself and a coworker headed further into the wilderness, leading on from what we believed were likely to be the bear man's tracks, but we couldn't know for certain. We crossed a few miles of meadows and streams, keeping our eyes on the ground for any sign of our bear man, but all we found were animal tracks, a few droppings, but nothing human. The man had no doubt gone deeper into the park, in which case we were traveling in the right direction, so to not find a single sign of him beyond what we'd already found was deeply unsettling. And after a while, myself and my partner started to believe that going any further was a waste of time. If we hadn't found any trace of the man, then we were in the wrong area. But then, right as we were about to turn back and return the goat to HQ, we found the charms. Now, I don't know if charms is the right word here, but the word in Russian is obereg, and it means like trinkets that have a holy or spiritual power to them. Some are related to the church and consists of lengths of blessed rope that some tie around the necks of their dogs, but others are related to zagovori, or Slavic folk conjuring, and do not bring blessings, but only curses. And so, as you can imagine, it was a very unpleasant surprise to find that the ones we discovered that day were almost certainly of the second variety. The first one we found was hanging from a low branch and consisted of a small bird's skull with a backboard of woven twigs. Now, my partner pulled it from the tree and gave me a look. Such things were not strictly legal during communism. Zagovori wasn't against the law, but a man could expect some extensive psychiatric treatment, quote-unquote, if he was found to have faith in such ancient superstitions. We didn't take this as an indication that our bear man was a crazy person worshipping the old gods, but we certainly took it as a sign that he wasn't interested in respecting our authority as foresters. Now, having realized that we were closer than we first thought, we decided to push on into the forest. Then only after a short distance, we found more of what we could only assume was the bear man's charms. Not all of them included animal bones, only the most disturbing ones. But each and every one let us know that we were in this man's territory, some place he did not want us to be. There was still the question of if this man actually made the charms, but we had to assume it was him because the idea of 2 or more people running around with furs while making charms, that was just too unsettling for us to consider just yet. And since we had his territory roughly marked out, myself and my partner returned to HQ to report what we'd found. Now, our boss told us that he'd organize a wider search with a larger team for the next morning. And at dawn, we hiked alone to cover more ground, using radios to keep in touch with each other. But this proved to be a big mistake. At around mid-morning, one of our team was walking through the area that we'd explored the day before when suddenly, the very ground beneath his feet seemed to give way. At a pure instinct, the forester turned as he fell and tried as best as he could to propel himself away from the drop. This meant that he was able to hang on, but only barely before he used all of his might to drag himself to safety. Now, once he'd managed to find his feet, he turned around to inspect what he'd almost fallen into. And that's when he discovered a deep pit full of sharpened stakes. And there were 6 in total, and each was sharp enough to puncture a man's boot, should he have fallen with enough force. And since he was safe to do so, the team member called in what he'd found over his radio, and we all went rushing over to his position to check it out. And only then did we realize how serious the situation was. This bear man didn't simply mean to mark out his forest fiefdom. He was determined to wound or potentially even kill anyone who pursued him. And since we were not armed at the time, we retreated to our various HQs, either northern, central, or southern, and awaited further orders from our boss. Now, we were itching to find the man and have the police arrest him for almost snuffing out one of our team. And then when the time finally came to strike back, it came with fantastic news. The next time we went out looking for the bear man, we were told that we'd be equipped with rifles loaned from the local Red Army militia, like your Army Reserves kind of thing. and we were also ordered to travel in teams of 2 for safety, which was also music to our ears. And we thought this could keep us safe and that the sight of us with weapons might scare this bear man away, but we were wrong. Dead wrong. And just a few hours into the search, we received a frantic call over our radios from one of the 2-man teams. The caller sounded terrified as he explained that they were under attack from an unknown position. They couldn't see the attacker, but their attacker could see them, meaning they'd been forced to fall back at a rapid pace to avoid being hurt or killed. Now, we hadn't heard any gunfire, which was obviously very strange if these 2 men were under fire, but we also knew which sector the pair had been assigned, so we went running in their direction with our rifles ready. Now, we expected to hear gunfire on our approach, but we didn't. We only heard the sound of our 2 frightened coworkers running for their lives and yelling for us to help them. When they saw us, they began shouting about how he was behind them, and then they frantically began urging us to rake the area behind them with bullets because he was there, we just couldn't see him. They had clearly not been spooked by anything imaginary. Someone had most definitely given them a fight, but to us, it looked like they were running from ghosts. Now, the 2 men refused to come out of cover for a minute or 2, saying that there had been arrows flying at us any second. Now, this is the point where we all asked them, "Arrows? Are you sure?" But we didn't need to take their word for it because after carefully retracing their steps, we found one of the arrows that had been shot at them buried in the trunk of a tree. Now, that incident with the arrows marked the end of our forester patrols. The boss refused to allow us to return to that area of the forest without a militia escort, the militia being the Soviet militarized police force here. They could bring their Kalashnikov and PKM machine guns with them, all fully automatic, unlike the SK rifles we used, which dated back to the Great Patriotic War. And a week later, and once they had assembled, we guided the 24-strong militia unit towards the bear man's territory, and then we hiked up and down the forest all day long in search of him. Seeing as we were a larger force, we were able to cover much more ground, but no arrows or bullets were fired, and we failed to discover the man's living arrangements. We thought that, since we didn't encounter him a second time, the bear man had most probably moved on, and this made a lot of sense to us as he'd seen us walking through his woods with rifles just a week or so prior. If the man really was confined to a simple bow and arrow, then we had him sorely outgunned, and it only made sense for him to flee while he still had his luck. But the man had not moved on. On the contrary, he simply waited to strike on his own terms. About a week after the militia helped us sweep the forest, 2 foresters staying in a northern sector cabin received a very frightening surprise in the middle of the night when they discovered that someone had snuck up to their cabin and set it on fire. Luckily, one of the foresters was awake and heard the glass bottle smash on the wood outside before the sudden burst of flames sent him rushing for the fire extinguisher. He tried his very best to douse the flames, but those old Soviet military fire extinguishers that we had were next to useless, and he was unable to put out the fire. Both foresters managed to escape the burning cabin with their lives, but the incident marked a further escalation in this conflict. Instead of us going hunting for him, this bear man was now hunting us. And the boss had called the militia back into the forest, only that time they arrived with more than twice the numbers. Instead of just 24 men, they sent an entire company of militarized police to comb the bear man's territory, and that time he didn't simply watch and wait for the policemen to corner him. He attacked. Chaos erupted around midday when one of the militia officers was shot with an arrow. Thankfully, it only punched through the meat of his shoulder and did not penetrate any internal organs, but we all heard the man's screams of agony echoing around the forest before a storm of gunfire commenced. The men accompanying the wounded officer opened fire into the woods, shooting everywhere and anywhere in the hopes of hitting their hidden attacker. When they finished, no more arrows came after their storm of gunfire, and following a search of the area, blood trails were found leading deeper into the forest. The militia tracked these blood trails with dogs, and after hours of marching deep into the woods, they finally found one of the man's living spaces, consisting of little more than a dugout that used pine branches for shelter. The blood trails had ceased long before then, presumably after the bear man tended to his wounds, but despite there being ample evidence of him residing there, he was nowhere to be found around his improvised living space. Now, that final militia patrol marked the end of our encounters with the bear man. There were no more arrows fired, no more charms found, not for a long time anyway. We thought the man had either succumbed to his wounds or decided to vacate the area entirely. And either way, we had dealt with a problem that could have easily resulted in one of us losing their lives, and so as you can imagine, we were very relieved to be able to focus on our jobs again. Now at this point, years have passed, and the Iron Curtain fell, and overnight we found that we didn't have jobs to even do anymore. Some had stuck around living off the land and off what little our old money could buy us, but then slowly and surely, one by one, foresters started leaving, some for Moscow or Perm to find work, and others to foreign countries where they'd hoped to start a new life. I ended up being one of those men who left Russia for good, but during that process of getting a visa, packing up my things, and saying goodbye to family, I often wondered if I was doing the right thing or not. But do you know what happened to make me realize that I was doing the right thing? It was when I heard from an old coworker, still living in and working in Yugoslavia, that on a routine tree count, another one of the bear man's charms had been found. Only this one looked brand new. And I've never looked back, not because I don't miss Russia, which I do a lot sometimes. It's because there was never just one wild man wearing his bear's head, hoping to kill or wound foresters. There were more, perhaps even a lot more. And it felt like it was only a matter of time before that same bloody struggle played out, all over again. My name is Ion, and I'm a forester here in Romania. I lived in a small village very close to the forest, and every morning after waking up early, I put on my uniform and I head out into the forest. And my job is really quite simple. Just like my colleagues, I walk many kilometers every day to check the trees. We mark old or sick ones to be cut legally, and then we count the number of young trees and plant new ones in the spring. Now, we keep our eyes peeled for bears and wolves or lynx, because they too must be monitored and counted just like the trees. But one of our most common activities is stopping cars and trucks to check their papers and check for illegal wood. Because without a doubt, the single biggest problem that we have here is illegal logging. Now, they mostly come at night with axes and chainsaws, and then cut down the best and oldest trees, either beech, oak, or spruce, and then haul them away as fast as they can. Now, you might ask yourself, well, how many trees can these people cut down? It can't be many. Well, sometimes the larger gangs can cut down to 100 trees per night, and they do this night after night, taking very few nights off, so in that space of about a month, we can lose thousands upon thousands of healthy, old-growth trees. Now, many of the foresters, the less reputable ones, take bribes from the loggers. The rest of us are intimidated with their axe and chainsaws, and sometimes they even carry guns, something we ourselves were not allowed to carry until 2019, at which point it was too late to stop this story's events from unfolding. Illegal logging is very damaging to the forest, and not just in the ways that you might assume. Without the trees, the soil washes away when it rains. This muddies rivers, causes them to burst their banks, and they flood villages to cause devastating and sometimes lasting damage to people's lives. Logging also frightens the animals, who either flee their habitats or are killed as their nests or dens come crashing down, or are crushed by those same falling trees. And I fear that if we lose our beautiful places, my children will not get to see the big old forest that I saw when I was young. And that thought breaks my heart, but it also gives us the will to fight them. And it's just that. This fight has required many sacrifices, not just in time and effort, but in blood. And for a long time, we used to hide in the forest at night with a notebook and a flashlight. If the group of illegal loggers was large enough, we would simply hide in the darkness, take notes on their numbers. However, if the group is small enough, we can sometimes trick them into thinking that we are more in numbers, at which point they will abandon their lumber, jump into their trucks, and drive away. But this isn't always the case. Sometimes the loggers go on the attack and will rush us with their chainsaws and axes at the ready. And believe me, you have not seen your life flash before your eyes like you will when a man with a revving chainsaw is running at you full speed. It's a horror that I'm never likely to forget. Now, we call the police when this happens, but they are stationed far from the forest and only ever arrive too late to do anything about the loggers. Now, for the most part, us foresters tried our best to stop the logging, and we also tried to root out those of us who have been taking bribes. We tried very hard, but we were mostly unsuccessful in this. And in the end, the government decided to tar us all with the same brush. So one day our boss summoned us all to the headquarters because he'd had an announcement to make. The local government had gotten sick of us failing to adequately deal with the problems of the loggers, and after learning of a few isolated cases of foresters taking bribes, they decided that we all had been corrupt. Our protests fell on deaf ears as the government had already decided what they were going to do. If we weren't going to root out those taking bribes, then we would all have to pay for the lost lumber. Thousands of liu, our national currency, would be taken from our collective paychecks every single week, and the longer we failed to deal with the problem, the longer the deductions would continue. We were furious, absolutely furious, but this was also at a time when we had but two options to choose from: work as agreed and lose out on pay, or quit and face the possibility of not being able to put food on our families' tables. And for some of the younger foresters, it was a tough choice. But for those of us with families, we had only one option: ramp up our efforts to rid the forest of those loggers, no matter what the physical or spiritual cost. And at this stage, we were still not permitted to carry guns around the park, so we had to think creatively to scare off the loggers. And at first we used firecrackers, very large and powerful ones that we could launch through the trees from a distance. These would explode over the loggers' heads and terrified them when they were working in the darkness. But then after a while, they learned not to be bothered by them and would just carry on until we ran out of fireworks to launch. And after that, we tried bringing dogs to scare the loggers, but they called our bluff as we weren't willing to risk the safety of our loyal furried friends, so we didn't sick them on the loggers anymore. And all the while, we petitioned the government to allow us to carry guns with which to defend ourselves, but at each turn, we were told the same thing over and over: you're not soldiers, you're not police, and it's too dangerous. In the end, we were told to focus on intel gathering in the hopes that we would turn over what we found to the police and have them arrest the loggers in their homes. But this was a very slow process, and as we began to lose money, we began taking risks. For months, we found ourselves fighting a losing battle, and then finally a small victory gave us a massive boost of morale. Two of the foresters, Niku and Gavril, were out on patrol one night when they found a group of loggers. There were a lot of them and only two of our foresters, but then instead of simply observing them and taking notes, Niku and Gavril hatched a plan. And this was at a time when, if one lone forester confronted the loggers would just simply chase them away with their axes and chainsaws. And so when Niku began shouting at them and walking straight over to them with his flashlight switched on, some of the loggers stopped their cutting and began walking towards him. And there was shouting of all kinds of curses, making a big scene, and although not all of the loggers went to chase Niku away, it caused enough of a scene to draw the attention of those who remained behind. Meaning no one saw Gavril sneak up to their truck and stab holes in 3 of its 4 tires. No one saw him sneaking up, and no one saw him sneaking away. And then the next morning, a second pair of foresters found the illegal logger's truck abandoned with those 3 flat tires. We were elated, and we celebrated the abandoned truck like we had just won a battle in some great war. We were able to sell the illegally harvested lumber to recoup the forest's losses and plant many new trees, and we also had a new and effective way of fighting the loggers, and that brought our spirits up an incredible amount. But sadly, it didn't even last a month. because just a few weeks later, little Pavel was out patrolling on his own in a section of forest that we didn't think was of any interest to the loggers, and we found out that we were wrong. It was the middle of the night when we got a call from Pavel saying that the loggers were trying to outsmart us by logging where we didn't expect them to. He said there were lots of them too, 2 trucks worth, so he needed backup to try and scare them off or distract them enough to get a knife into the truck's tires. Those of us that were on duty and could access a vehicle rushed to Pavel's aid. We were hopeful, knowing that we could stop those loggers if we could only get a man near the trucks. But then as we all rushed to Pavel's position, he started talking over his radio again. He said the trucks had almost finished loading up and that the loggers were preparing to leave. We told him not to do anything alone, but after that, he stopped responding on his radio. I panicked, and so did everyone else who heard the radio so quiet. Then, when I arrived at the scene, only my fellow foresters were present and the loggers had disappeared entirely. But to our worry, so had Pavel. And we spent the rest of the night searching for him, walking in pairs with our flashlights and calling out his name. We searched for miles around, but when daylight finally came, he turned out to be no more than 100 yards from where we were first standing. We all knew that he had been found, and we all knew the search had come to an end, because we heard a man screaming like his sanity was slipping away. He had found Pavel, and they had chopped and sawed him to pieces. It was without a doubt the worst crime I had ever had the misfortune of laying eyes on, and in my time as a forester, I had seen a number of very grisly murders and very gory accidents, but not one of them, not even the prostitute who was found broken in half and shoved into the cavity of a tree, managed to horrify me as much as seeing Pavel in pieces. It affected everyone terribly, and many of us went to Pavel's funeral to console his mother with how brave he'd been. I wouldn't say his sacrifice was worth it, because we should have been given weapons long before Pavel lost his life, but his death prompted our bosses to enter into serious talks with local politicians who relented and allowed us to carry rifles. We're not allowed to open fire unless we're directly threatened, but seeing us with rifles was all it took to scare the loggers into going someplace else. We put a brass plaque up at the HQ to honor Pavel's sacrifice, and it's a reminder to new foresters that they are lucky to be a part of a new generation who are allowed to defend themselves. We still face danger, and illegal logging hasn't stopped entirely, but now, no one will ever suffer the same fate as poor Pavel, who died while protecting the forest from human greed. I've worked for the Forest Service for the past 15 years or so, and it's a job that comes with a set of pretty unique challenges in terms of law enforcement. And one of the biggest problems we face is that of illegal hunting. No matter how flexible we are, and no matter how much prior warning we give the local hunting community, there are still those who seek to bypass the law in order to bag themselves a buck at a season. It's probably one of the most infuriating things we deal with too, because if everyone acted like the out-of-season hunters, there'd be far fewer deer and other animals to hunt in season, and it might well contribute to a population spiral among the local fauna. And they acted like the rules shouldn't apply to them, and they give you the worst excuses. Like one guy swore on all he held dear that he thought it was still September. I mean, he'd have to be a moron to forget what month it was, and he'd have to have pegged me for even more of an idiot to believe an excuse like that. Needless to say, we take illegal hunting very seriously. So when we get reports that they're operating out there, putting the animal population in danger, you can bet your bottom dollar that we act on them. So one day, when I got word that some illegal hunting might have been taking place in a particular area of the forest, I drove over immediately to check it out. Now, one of the techniques we use to identify illegal hunting is examining tree trunks in the suspect area. Now, be it a fresh scar in the bark, a small puncture buried beneath new growth, or the piece of metal detected just under the surface, there are many ways to tell if a rifle or shotgun had recently been fired in a certain location. A bullet lodged at a certain height can tell investigators not only where a hunter stood when taking a shot, but also the direction the shot was fired, and we can also use the frequency of said damage to determine if it's a place poachers use as a regular spot. If the trajectory of the shot lines up with the habitat of a protected species, it might even help officers build a case involving the killing of said protected species. And in light of that, us rangers sometimes use metal detectors to locate lead or steel hidden beneath a tree's bark, or, in serious cases, bullets may be removed for ballistic testing. A cartridge dug out of a tree can link a crime scene to a specific firearm just as it might in traditional criminal investigation. Logging companies also have a large vested interest in this because when their saws hit metal buried in wood, the blades can be ruined and operators can be severely wounded, sometimes even killed. In fact, a lot of the reports that we get come from sawmills, who alert the authorities to places where gunfire into trees happens frequently. In this way, trees can serve as a sort of silent witness. Long after an illegal shot had been fired, the evidence may still be lodged there, right inside the wood. So, after getting the report and driving over to the area in question, I grabbed a handheld metal detector from my truck and then went walking through the trees looking for any sign of gunshot damage. Sometimes buckshot damage looks like scratching from deer antlers, which they do remove velvet and mark territory, so sometimes you'll run the detector over a suspected patch of bark only to get nothing. But then after walking for maybe half a mile, I saw some pretty glaring evidence of shotgun damage to a tree. Now, it was a clear example of buckshot damage, one of the clearest I'd ever seen, so I had no doubt whatsoever what had caused the damage. But when I ran the detector over the stop, it just stayed silent. This was obviously very confusing because even the smartest illegal hunter doesn't bother to go digging into tree trunks to retrieve tiny pieces of metal, and from what I could tell from the naked eye, there was a lot of it stuck in that tree. So much so that it might have even come from multiple shots. I pulled out the small knife that I carry with me at times and then started to carefully pull away some of the bark around the affected area. Now once again, it was quite clearly some ballistic damage because of the obvious tunneling, but when I got to the bottom of one tunnel, it wasn't a fragment of dull metal that I saw, but a kind of off-white, almost porcelain-looking substance. I'd never seen anything like it in my life, and I've been working for the Forest Service for almost 10 years by that point, so naturally, I was very focused to get to the bottom of it. I used my knife to scrape away some of the wood so I could dislodge the small off-white clump, but then after very carefully extracting it from the tree and examining it up close, I was so shocked that I remember letting out a gasp as I almost dropped it. It wasn't a piece of buckshot. It wasn't a bullet. It was a tooth, and from what I could tell, it was a human tooth. As a ranger, you learn to identify the teeth and/or bones of all the various animals that call the park home. Birds are probably the easiest to identify, and then deer teeth are pretty easy seeing as how flat they are. And the same applies to carnivore teeth too, as their distinct shape makes them very easy to identify. And so when I pulled what was quite clearly a front tooth out of that tree, there was no doubt in my mind that it was holding a person's tooth, and not an animal's. Now, we might be forest rangers, but we're still law enforcement, and we're charged with all of the same duties as regular police officers. So when I found that tooth, my first thought following the initial shock was, I need to preserve the rest of the evidence. I walked back to my truck, called in what I'd found over the radio, and then made my way back to the damaged tree to string a bunch of crime scene tape around the surrounding undamaged trees. One of my coworkers was on scene within the hour, and when I showed them what I'd found, they also admitted to finding it incredibly scary. We also felt kind of powerless because I'd say 90% of stuff that goes on in the forest stays in-house, so to speak, as in we deal with it ourselves. But something as bizarre and unexpected as teeth being buried in a tree would require a team of crime scene technicians, possibly even a forensic anthropologist, since we didn't even know how old they were and how long they'd been stuck in that tree. Now, it took days before a full team was assembled, but then one morning, right at the break of dawn, a whole team of techs and forensic guys and a photographer were all headed towards the taped-up area. Everything was photographed. The tree, the ground around it, and positioning of the damage, as well as a close-up to show the teeth still lodged in the trunk. Only when all that was done did they actually go about removing the rest of the teeth from the tree, and they only did so using tools meant to preserve even the smallest trace of DNA or residue. The team also took samples of the wood too, because the rate of growth can help determine how long the teeth have been there. My coworker and I stood there watching them all morning and then offering any information that they might find useful. The investigators seemed particularly interested in there being any unusual activity in recent weeks, and we said if there had been any, we sure hadn't spotted it. And then after that, it was up to the lab to do their tests, so all we could do was wait patiently to hear back. Obviously, our number one question involved who the teeth belonged to, and so did the lab, and so the very first thing we did was compare them to the dental records of those on the National Missing Persons Registry. Now, unfortunately, they didn't get a match, but they were able to quickly move on to DNA testing, which everyone believed would be more likely to bring up a match. DNA testing doesn't just tell you who something belongs to, it tells who their relatives are too. So even if the lab didn't get a direct match, there was a chance that we'd be able to contact who could fill us in on the whole picture. But there were no matches, none whatsoever. Whoever's teeth were in that tree had no relatives on that system, living or dead. And while that's not entirely out of the question, it was another deeply unsettling little detail that we had to contend with. In the end, we never did find out exactly how those teeth ended up in that tree. All we got were just a list of likely theories. One that's worth mentioning, although it turned out to be false, was the idea one of my coworkers had. He figured that it might be some kind of Native American burial site, so old that a tree actually grew up and brought some of this guy's teeth with it. Now, I mean, there was obviously a chance of foul play and that some poor soul had taken a shotgun blast at close range or something, but if that was the case, there would have been shotgun fragments buried along with it. And as one coworker said, it was almost like someone had loaded up a shotgun shell with human teeth and then just fired them at the tree. Now, this was the one scenario, no matter how unlikely, creeped the ever-living crap out of us thinking about it. In fact, just about the only comfort that we had was the idea that those teeth were old, really old, and that if their owners had suffered at all, at least it hadn't been recent. Something we maybe could have done something about and failed to. But just about the only conclusive thing the lab brought back to us was that the teeth appeared to have been buried in that tree trunk for just over a year at maximum, and that they belonged to a man in his 40s at the time of presumably death. Now that was a bitter pill to swallow, knowing that I'd actually been working as a ranger around the time of such a thing happening. The forest is a big place too, and by comparison, our ranger team is little more than a skeleton crew, so it's impossible for us to be everywhere at once. But still, it's a bitter pill to swallow. And they never did find out who those teeth belonged to, and no one could say for sure that it was murder, or that his teeth had ended up in that tree some other way. Now, I try not to think about it because when I did, it made walking among those trees all the more creepier. And even now that I'm retired, I still think about those teeth every so often and wonder how in the world they ended up deep in that tree. I've been a U.S. Forest Ranger for the better part of 3 decades, and in that time, I've heard some mighty tall tales from various hikers and campers. We've had more Bigfoot sightings than I can count, about 20-something UFO encounters, and one guy even swore that he saw Jimmy Hoffa, the union boss who disappeared, hiding out in the barrens and living in an RV. It's not just the reports we receive either, because when certain people find out that I'm a ranger, they sometimes ask me about strange or unexplained encounters that I might have experienced while on duty. I appreciate the question, it's a lot more exciting than the stuff I'm usually asked, but unfortunately, my answers tend to disappoint them. I've never seen any kind of undocumented animals out here, nor have I seen any strange lights hovering in the sky, and the only hairy bipedal growling monsters I've seen stomping through the woods have been my coworkers during early mornings. The only thing that's ever happened that's left me truly disturbed doesn't even make for a good story, I don't think. It doesn't have a beginning, a middle, or an end. It was all just confusion, fear, and unanswered questions, and it started when a ranger named Ron went missing while out on patrol. It was a regular morning and Ron was out performing a fire management inspection when he suddenly stopped responding to radio calls. A ranger drove out to his last known location where he found Ron's truck abandoned and his radio sitting on the passenger seat. A brief search of the area surrounding the truck yielded nothing, so by that late evening, we had state search and rescue guys out there, walking the woods with their sniffing dogs. And it turned out to be a relatively simple process of letting the dogs lead us to him, and after letting them sniff around Ron's truck for a little bit, we expected Ron to be injured in some way, as there were few other reasons why he'd just drop out of contact like that. But when we found him, it was way worse than we thought. Ron was cold and he looked to be suffering some kind of allergic reaction. I had a cousin that was allergic to peanuts, and Ron looked and sounded exactly like my cousin did when he accidentally ate something with peanut brittle in it one Halloween. Only, it wasn't just Ron's face and neck that looked incredibly swollen, it was his arms and hands too. They were this sort of deep pink, and the skin was so stretched and taut that it looked almost shiny. The same reddy pink discoloration was consistent all along his arms and hands, but around his fingertips, the skin had become so dark it was almost black. Now, we had a medic with us, so she rushed into action as soon as we found him. She cleared Ron's airway, put an IV in his arm, and then an ATV with a transport cot showed up to take him back to the headquarters. And from there, he was airlifted to a hospital, and by the time he was in that chopper being lifted up into the air, we were a mess. We had no idea what had happened to him out there, and what he'd done or what he'd found. Instead, just about the only thing we did know was that there was a good chance Ron wasn't going to make it. The medics who treated him looked panicked as they tried to figure out what was wrong with him, and one of them even told us straight that it wasn't looking good for him. One of the rangers, a lady named Susie, was in tears by the time we sat down in HQ again. We thought about Ron's wife and kids and how worried they must be, and it just tore us up. Over the next few days, we stayed in almost constant contact with the hospital, awaiting word of any change at all in Ron's condition. Then thankfully, our prayers were answered, and around 72 hours after he was admitted, doctors announced that he'd been stabilized and that he'd most likely pull through. A few of us went to pay him a visit and found his wife in a chair at his bedside. We were obviously very happy to see him awake and alert, so it made for an emotional reunion, but there was an elephant in the room. A very large one too, because each of us were desperately wanting to know what the hell had happened to him. And when we asked, we were incredibly frustrated to hear that, essentially, Ron couldn't really remember what had happened to him. He remembers walking through the woods, looking for buildups of dead wood or dry pine needles, when he suddenly spotted what looked to be a piece of black volcanic rock lying on the ground. It looked very out of place in a forest with no major deposits of that kind of stuff, and so assuming it had been dropped by a hiker, Ron walked over to it and picked it up. He said nothing felt out of the ordinary at first. It felt kind of light, much like a lot of volcanic rocks, but then as he was walking with it, it started to feel very warm in his hands. This was one of the last things he remembered, as he dropped the rock, knowing that whatever was happening, it probably wasn't good for him. And he then said that looking at it just lying there on the ground was when his memory started to get very hazy. He remembered the swelling feeling and he remembered not being able to breathe properly, but after that, there was just darkness until he woke up in a hospital bed with all those tubes sticking out of him. Now, after a couple of their agents came to talk to him, Ron directed the EPA towards where he'd been patrolling, and they sent a couple of guys over to look for the rock he'd found. At first, doctors were afraid that it had been radioactive, and that Ron was suffering from some kind of acute radiation sickness. They were able to rule that out very quickly thanks to the technology they had at hand, but that only allowed them to rule out one of many possible explanations, and in order to save his life, they needed that list to get much shorter, much quicker. The medical team tried everything, but only managed to reduce the severity of Ron's condition and not alleviate it entirely, and that at some point, right around hour 60, Ron's condition began to stabilize, seemingly on its own, after which his prognosis improved dramatically. And by the time we visited, the doctors were safely able to rule out any kind of allergic reaction. But obviously they wouldn't be able to figure out exactly what had happened to Ron until the EPA was able to recover the rock that he'd touched. Only, this is where things get weird because the EPA guy couldn't find any trace of any such a volcanic rock anywhere. Now, they walked over the grid squares that Ron had given them, and this was solid info because we had a digital record of where he'd been headed that morning. But after combing through the undergrowth with a fine-toothed comb for hours and hours on end, they didn't manage to find a single piece of rock fitting the description that Ron had given them. They obviously didn't want a hazardous or toxic substance getting into someone else's hand, so they tried their damnedest to find it. But they couldn't, and that scared us. Having something like that around the forest quite obviously posed a danger to the public. Now, we tried our best to warn visitors not to pick up any strange rocks and to report anything unusual directly to the Forest Service office. We were terrified the same thing would happen to a curious hiker or, God forbid, a child. But nothing ever did, and it was like that little piece of warm rock had just disappeared from the face of the earth. And without it, there was no way that we'd ever definitively find out what had happened to Ron. Ron did get better, but he never did come back to work, and he ended up getting a job working with his brother in some home renovations. It was good money, but Ron loved being a ranger, so we knew something really must have frightened him to want to throw in the towel altogether. I can't say it's kept me up at night. It's all long in the past, but I still sometimes catch myself wondering just what the hell he found out there. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday nights. And if you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, link down below, and you might be able to hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, Skibbity Riz, Ohio, the zonkler hitting the gritty, drinking the grimace shake. For a whole lot of people, 2020 was a really tough year. A lot of good folks lost their job, some lost their minds too, I guess, and we all had trouble getting our hands on the stuff we needed. Well, the same was true for a lot of bad people too, myself included. As a functioning opioid addict at the time of the pandemic, supply chain issues and general anxiety made it much harder than usual to get a clean fix. It also made it way harder for me to make money since the restaurant I worked at was closed for weeks at a time. My stimulus check didn't last long, and then after a few weeks of burning through my emergency fund, I was starting to get a little worried. Not only that, but the number of dealers going temporarily offline for the lockdowns was getting higher and higher, which in turn drove up the price of everything. I needed a money-making scheme and fast, so I tried all kinds of things, including setting up a .onion domain. Now, a .onion domain is basically a website on the dark web. Now, I can hear all you nerds howling, actually, already, but that's basically what it is, and to be honest, it was a little more than a joke to start with. Now, I wanted to learn how to set up a tour site anyways, so what I uploaded ended up just being somewhere between a joke and a Hail Mary, and I worked pretty hard on it, and when it went live, I felt pretty damned proud of it. And then plastered at the top of the page was the site's title and concept, Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap, or 5D for short. Now, it was a reference to one of my all-time favorite AC/DC songs, and I figured it was the perfect way to sell a very specific set of services to the people of East Texas and Western Louisiana. Now see, I might have been a scumbag drug addict, but I was also something of an adrenaline junkie too. I wasn't out to walk old ladies' dogs or help people move apartments. I wanted to do something exciting, something to liven up lockdown, so I offered people a chance to get revenge. Whether it was a bitter ex or some a-hole boss, I was offering to pull a mean prank on them for a pre-arranged price. Clients paid half before the job and half after, on pain of their victim finding out exactly who paid for the prank to be pulled. I didn't think it would get much traction. I mean, it's not like it was a surface layer website that'd show up on Google if I paid them a few bucks a month. A person needed a Tor browser to get access to 5D, and normies don't use Tor. But then one day, I checked the site's email address on a total whim and was surprised to find a job request in its inbox. Now, the message was from an anonymous user, as they all were, who said their ex-boyfriend was an abusive a-hole who needed to be taken down a peg. Now, I offered to shove a bunch of sardines into the vent of his car and explained how they'd be stinking to high heaven after just a day or two in the summer heat. Now, she thought that was a good idea, transferred me half that Bitcoin, and then that night, I drove over to the address that I'd been given where I did the dirty deed. Now, I then took photographic evidence and then received the second half of the payment once I'd driven back home. Now, the girl seemed real happy with the end result, and so she was only too happy to pay. And then when I told her to recommend me to a friend, she actually did, and I got my second job just a couple of days later. Those first two jobs were the only ones that I had for like 3 months, but when the second stay-at-home order was issued by Greg Abbott, I guess more and more people decided to screw around on the dark web, but slowly and surely, business started to pick up. Now, I smeared a bunch of dog crap on some guy's front door handle, apparently because he stiffed a client out of overtime pay. I then plastered this lady's house in a bologna mosaic because the acid in cheap bologna etches clear coat in the sun and ruins a paint job. And I was told that she gave a kid a bad grade for some petty personal reason, but I didn't care, as long as the Bitcoin arrived in my wallet. Now, I even rolled a bunch of glitter onto a driveway, and sprayed a bunch of herbicide onto a lawn so it spelled out a curse word, and I once painted a house with pure fish emulsion at night. It seeps into whatever it touches and makes a place smell like low tide mixed with death for like 6 weeks. And as you can tell, I became something of an artist when it came to pulling especially mean pranks. And then with all the photographic evidence that I was uploading to the site, visitors were able to see how serious and effective I was, and that generated a lot of business. Things started fairly light, shall we say, with my mainstay being mean revenge pranks. But then as time went on, the job started to get a little more sinister. And one time a user asked me to take a package from a deserted pickup point to a deserted dead drop, and I knew it was probably drugs or something, maybe a hot pistol wrapped up tight in a t-shirt and taped up. But the price was right, and so the job was done. And I used to get similar or identical jobs maybe once or twice a week too, so those were my big earners for a while. But then came stuff that really started to push my limit. One time I was instructed to pick up a thumb drive from this dead drop, and then I had to take it to some dude over in Kilgore who either put something on it or copied something from it before taking it back to the dead drop. I don't know what the heck was on that thumb drive, and neither do I want to, but from the look of the dude that I dealt with, whatever it was very, very nasty. And that was the first time that I got home from a job and figured that I should probably be a little bit more choosy when it came to the jobs I took. I wasn't even desperate for cash by then either, because the restaurant had opened again and I was getting shifts. Now, I wasn't going to do it for money anymore. I was kind of just doing it for kicks. I did a few more jobs, nothing too sinister, but I was really starting to notice the change in clientele. I was getting fewer and fewer jobs that could be described as harmless pranks, and more that, like those others, made me feel sick to my stomach once they were over and done with. I'd already decided to close the site when that last request came in, but as you'll soon see, I had no choice but to entertain it when I saw how much money they were talking. And so by this stage, I was checking 5D's email only once or twice a week instead of every day. I was mostly just skimming the emails, turning my nose up to all the weirder requests that were most likely way more illegal than just making someone's car smell like anchovies. But then, I saw this one request. one which promised me way more money than I'd ever been paid before. I charged a couple of $100 for more basic jobs, a couple of $1,000 for much more complex or costly ones like the fish one, but this one was offering me $10,000 for a single night's work. Now, I emailed them back, saying if the job involved physically hurting anyone, I wasn't interested, and they replied saying that I wouldn't have to hurt anyone, but that the job might require coercion and possibly some physical force too. But for 10 grand, I was more than willing to get a little handsy with someone if I could guarantee a clean getaway. And only then did I ask what they needed, and only then did they drop the bombshell on me. They wanted me to kidnap someone. Now obviously I had questions, and the first one was, who? Now I wasn't expecting the answer they gave me, and not because of the name they gave me either, very much the opposite. You see, they didn't give me a name, they just told me, anybody. And once they told me the job was to kidnap literally any female, preferably an adult, but a child would do, I was thinking, no way, dude. This is either a prank or a fed. But then they lost me altogether by claiming that they were part of some big, shadowy organization that liked to partake in, of all things, live cannibalism. That's not just regular old cannibalism either, people. Like the kind that kept the Donner Party going. Live cannibalism involves amputating parts of your victim while they're still alive, and then cooking and consuming said parts while the victim is forced to watch. I called the guy out, told him I didn't believe a word of that, and said that he wouldn't be hearing from me again. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is when they sent me their X-Pub. Now, without getting too technical, if you put someone's X-Pub, Y-Pub, or Z-Pub into an extended public address in a blockchain explorer, you see their total crypto balance for any given wallet. It's not a particularly smart thing to show a stranger because you can see this person's transaction history too, not just the amount of crypto they've accrued. But this is how I realized this guy wasn't some bullcrapper and wasn't some edgy 15-year-old doing it for the lulz. The guy had $500,000 worth of Bitcoin, and his transaction history showed evidence of major traffic. He was 100% legit. Bitcoin was moving in and out of that wallet every single day, and some of the transactions were way higher than just 10K. It was probably the strongest evidence this guy could have possibly presented to me to prove that he was legitimate, and so as you can imagine, I was pretty stunned. But I wasn't horrified. Not yet. Just because the guy had a ton of Bitcoin at hand didn't mean it wasn't a prank. But instead of dismissing my concerns, this guy made every effort to address them. They wouldn't give me any details regarding their organization, only that they existed. But on the off chance any of the girls' remains were found and a murder investigation was opened, they also didn't want anyone who'd freak out and go to the cops. They wanted someone who could live with themselves, having sold a human life for just a few $1,000s, and I guess they figured that person was me. But they were wrong, dead wrong. As I ended up talking to this anonymous and apparently very wealthy user from around 11 at night to 3:30 in the morning, talking methods, techniques, and logistics. They had a drop-off location lined up and claimed that they could guarantee the site's security, but they also offered help in planning the actual kidnap and offered me a bunch of advice on how to coerce, intimidate, and overpower my potential victim. I actually typed out a bunch of it, but it's probably not very YouTube-friendly to be talking about that kind of stuff in videos. Specific stuff, I mean, so I'll just skip over the particulars of what I was told. But needless to say, it was detailed, it was extensive, and it was disturbing, and to me, it was yet more proof that this person was not just some prankster with a dark sense of humor. They were for real. I suppose now's a good time to make it clear that I had no intention whatsoever of actually going through with the job. As in, from the moment the word kidnap appeared on screen, I was out. And then after a certain point, every single question I asked and every piece of information I extracted was purely for the benefit of law enforcement. I didn't even confirm the job with the client, I just confirmed my interest and said that I'd get back to him within 24 hours. but not even 2 hours of those had passed before I had taken 5D offline. I was exhausted afterwards and I desperately needed to get to sleep, but I couldn't, and instead, I headed out to a payphone while it was still dark. I used a text-to-speech program on my phone to relay everything I'd been told to a police dispatcher, including the address of the drop-off point, which I'm assuming was the most useful to them, seeing as someone's name had to be tied to the deed. Now, what kept me awake, what pushed me to report what had happened rather than the 8 hours of sleep I needed, was something the anonymous user had said after I told them I wasn't interested. They told me it was 5 figures for one night's work, that it was worth my time and I wouldn't get caught if I only did it right. But once again, I just said not interested. In response, the guy then says, and this isn't verbatim, but I'll summarize, "If you won't do it, we'll find someone who will." Now, this was before I'd seen the guy's Bitcoin wallet, so the words didn't land as intended until after I'd seen it, but once I had, it changed everything. I mean, I still wasn't 100% sure that what had happened was for real, because you can never really be sure of strangers you meet online until you truly know them. But although I was creeped out enough to report it, I wasn't convinced that I'd heard anything about it, as like any sort of arrests or trials or anything of that nature. But then one day, I did. So this was in September, and I was just sort of mindlessly scrolling when I spotted a headline about a guy from Texas. And seeing as it was local news, the headline grabbed my attention right away, but what I read made my jaw drop. A man had just been convicted of soliciting murder and cannibalism on the internet, and his name was Alex Barter. Long story short, Barter ended up talking to an undercover cop online, and from what I read, he gave them pretty much the same speech that I'd been given by the anonymous user. The undercover cop was offered cash to procure a kidnap victim, and just like in my case, the person was open and honest about the fate awaiting the victim. And there was nothing in any of the articles about the Bitcoin wallet that I'd seen, and there was also minor deviations in what the cop appeared to have been told. But while it all sounded very familiar, seeing a picture of Barter was confusing to say the least. If you Google image search this guy's picture, you'll agree that I'm being very generous when I say that he hardly looks like a criminal mastermind. He was only 23 when he was convicted, and he was apparently acting alone. But Barter was first arrested in 2018, and it just took till 2020 to sentence him. So if that was the case, then who the heck had I been talking to if Barter had been acting alone? And that's what makes me think that there really is some kind of network of people out there. Maybe they're not quite the criminal geniuses they like to think they are, but they've got money, and by the looks of things, they've got people too. Maybe they're better described as fall guys or pawns if you're feeling fancy, but they got people out there doing the legwork for them to keep the rich guy's hands from getting dirty. And I think I encountered one of them, and to this day, it scares the crap out of me how people like that exist. There will be more of them too, and just like they told me, it's only a matter of time before they find someone willing to work with them. And that little factoid is something that still keeps me up at night, even all these years later. My name is Max, and I grew up in Germany, and for as long as I have lived, I have tried to live a good life. I obeyed my mother and father, and I worked hard in school and university, and then I ambitiously and meticulously prepared myself for a career at one of Germany's most elite manufacturing companies. I was ambitious, aggressively so, and I can't deny that, but I was never arrogant and always remained ethical and humble in all my dealings with others. I donated a portion of my salary to charity and even a portion of my time to a local deaf charity. And while I admit to doing this to bolster my own self of well-being, that came part and parcel with living a life of good works and community service. But it was still not enough to keep me out of trouble. By the age of 32, in 2010, I hadn't been involved in any sort of violent altercation since a schoolyard shoving match during a game of football. And I lived a simple, happy life, having married in 2008, and by 2010, we had decided to start trying for a baby. It was a happy and exciting period in my life, probably the happiest and most exciting I'd ever known, but it was exhausting too. I'm not trying to make a crude joke, I just simply mean that my wife and I began planning like crazy, picking out design plans and furniture for our upcoming nursery. Now, it was a lot to think about, and I ended up losing more than a few hours of sleep over it. But it wasn't just the prospect of becoming a first-time father that was keeping me up, because I'd also put my name in for a promotion at work. A position had opened up following the resignation of a colleague. It was essentially an assistant director's role for my division of the office, so while I wouldn't be in charge, I'd have dominion over my former coworkers. And almost everyone put their name forward for the role, and I was open with my colleagues about doing the same. Everyone wished each other luck, and I believed everyone had the attitude of let the best man win. But as I came to learn, that was not entirely the case. I remember the day that a colleague in another department gave me the good news. We had all interviewed for the position, but management had not yet decided who the best candidate had been, and so we were all still waiting to hear back from them when an old friend of mine pulled me aside. He was dating one of the bigwig secretaries, this girl named Clara who had access to the executive lounge, and it was there that she had heard a member of management explaining how strongly I'd interviewed and how I'd entered a final pool of just 4 potential candidates. And as you can imagine, this was fantastic news which made me very happy, and I rode that wave of excitement all day long. But when it came time to finish work and head home, I remember feeling the exhaustion starting to get to me. By the time I climbed into my car seat and slid the keys into the ignition, I actually considered napping for a little bit of an hour so I had the energy to drive home, but I decided against it. Then, and only then, did I fasten my seatbelt and check my rear view to see if anyone was behind me. And if I'd chosen to do so any later, I might presently be dead, because when I looked up, occupying one portion of my rear view was a masked man. I believed him to be a car thief or a carjacker, I suppose you might say, so I quickly locked my doors and turned on my engine, intent on driving away. And yet the moment I turned the key, I heard the first shot. My windshield shattered along with the back windows, and I instinctively lowered myself down in my seat. If I hadn't, I'd be dead right now, as a police officer told me one of the bullets traveled directly through the headrest where my skull had just been moments before. I was able to drive quite easily, but I was so panicked that I almost crashed into the adjacent row of cars as I turned out of the parking lot and into the open corridor. I don't know exactly when the gunman stopped shooting. I was too focused on my escape, so I didn't slide up in my seat and resume a regular driving position until I was out on the street again, and fleeing as fast as my car would travel. I'm not sure exactly how long I drove for, but I did so very quickly. It occurred to me that I might get pulled over by the police, but I decided I didn't care. It would save me waiting for them in the parking lot of the fast food restaurant, which is where I ended up calling them from after nearly getting into several accidents while driving. The police officer was there within just a few minutes, and after explaining what had happened to her, she calmly offered me a ride to the police station so I could give a longer and much more detailed statement. My car wasn't roadworthy anymore, so I was given a ride back home where I explained to my very tearful wife that someone had just tried to murder me for no apparent reason whatsoever. It was a terrible time for both of us, but for weeks I believed that I had been almost the victim of a very aggressive carjacker and nothing more. But I was wrong. The police found the man who tried to shoot me, and at first I was amazed. I had a lot of faith in the federal police force, but the speed at which they apprehended the man was impressive nonetheless. Once again, I expected his motive to either be greed or addiction, as in he wanted my vehicle. But while greed was indeed a factor, it was not my vehicle that the man wanted. He wanted my life. And after the police tracked him down and arrested him, the man chose to cooperate in exchange for a more lenient sentence, and what he told the police was truly shocking to me. He'd been hired to kill me after discovering that there was a bounty on my head, and he discovered this on a sort of invisible website accessible to only certain people who knew how to find it. The investigator used the English language term dark web when I spoke to him, but the significance of this was lost on me for quite some time until I heard about other people being targeted in similar contract killings. The man confessed to having been hired by an anonymous source and had no idea why they wanted me dead. But what he did say was that the man who hired him seemed to have a very intimate knowledge of my work schedule along with where I parked my car. And this is how we came to learn that it was probably one of my coworkers that had paid him for my death. But despite everyone in my department being questioned, as well as company executives, no arrests were made and no definitive evidence was ever found. Now, I wasn't surprised. The prognosis had been bleak from the beginning. If someone knew how to hire a hitman on that dark web, even if it was an incompetent one, they most likely had the wherewithal to delete any evidence of the exchange from their computers. And this meant that even after their digital devices were analyzed, police were no closer to finding the person who tried to have me killed. Naturally, a huge part of me wanted to depart the company and find work elsewhere. I couldn't possibly work alongside anyone I suspected of wanting me dead, and that's what I told the executives. It was a bitter irony to find out that I'd secured a job that I didn't even want anymore. But in the end, I was made an offer I couldn't refuse. Now, I was offered an inflated salary, extra benefits, and I was promised the company parking lot would be reinforced and manned by security from then on. I was also offered a considerable one-time payment as well as legal aid from the company's lawyers to keep the story out of the media as the executives didn't want any bad press. Now, if I was a single man, I might have refused on principle. But since I was trying to start a family, it was my future wife that made the final decision, and if anything, staying at the company might help me root out the person who tried to have me killed. But I never did figure out who it was. None of the other candidates, including those in the final pool, displayed any observably strange or erratic behaviors in the immediate aftermath, leading some to theorize that the person who hired my potential killer was someone from outside the company who was intent on doing it harm. Now, this remains the most haunting mystery of my entire life, but not purely because I came so close to a violent death. It's because it serves as a reminder that man can do everything right, keep himself spiritually and morally pure, and he can still attract the kind of evil that's been spoken about since man first learned to speak. Hello, Joel. You can call me H. I grew up in London, and when I was a kid, I had a massive interest in computers. Now, my parents did all right for themselves career-wise, meaning that they had enough money to buy a PC when they still ran on Windows 95, and I used to go crazy on MS Paint or play the video games on the floppy disks my dad had brought home from work. And to me, that computer was nothing short of magic. And then as I got older, I got more and more interested in how they worked. And then in the year 2000, Dad signed us up for a Telewest dial-up internet connection, and that changed everything. I became a full-on computer nerd, and possibly at the perfect time to do so. The country was in the final stages of its IT revolution, and a degree in almost anything IT-related meant a ticket to the gravy train. Companies all over the country were practically letting IT graduates name their salaries. Because if you could run their networks and servers and allow them access to e-commerce, you'd make them hundreds of times whatever they spent on you. Now, I landed myself on one such job in 2008, and to say that I'd landed on my feet would be an understatement, but I earned my keep. I was very good at my job, but only because of how deeply it fascinated me, and long before 2008, I'd been reading about something which had passed from scientific theory to urban legend. You might know it as the deep web. Now, the deep web is a very different concept to the dark web, even though the two terms are kind of used interchangeably. The concept of the deep web has been around ever since the internet was invented, as in no different than the concept of public and private property. There's nothing inherently sinister about setting up some private website, but it was also inevitable that certain people would use it for illicit means, and frankly, it's amazing that it took until the late 2000s for that to finally happen. And that's when the term dark web was coined, to describe these sinister sites that traded in highly illegal merchandise and in some cases, even murder. And as you can imagine, the prospect fascinated me. And so off I went looking for them, and that's when I found the Silk Road.
It was a fitting name, really, harking back to the 2nd century Pan-Asian trade route which brought spices and fine china to Europe. But this was anything but state-sanctioned. Set up by an American and launched in, I think it was 2011, the Silk Road didn't just sell drugs, it sold everything. But under that everything umbrella was a hell of a lot of drugs, guns, and other contraband like handheld hacking devices, banned media, or Asian-made sweets that were banned from US markets. Now you could count the list of rules on one hand, and almost everything functioned on an honor-based system, which turned my idea of drug dealing on its head. I'd always just assumed it was all about low purity, stepped-up products, and ripping people off at every turn. But the Silk Road was the polar opposite. It allowed wholesalers, and in some cases even manufacturers, to market their high-purity products at rock-bottom prices, mainly because they were cutting out the oh-so-expensive middlemen, and it was making people a hell of a lot of money. I visited the Silk Road every day for about 2 weeks before my curiosity evolved into something that I know now was greed, but at the time felt like opportunity. I made decent money, and I loved my job, but I was also lacking excitement in my life, and I was still young and stupid enough to really crave it. It also constituted a whole new system for me to obsess over, and by system, I mean the method by which drugs travel from their manufacturers to their consumers. I did enough research on shipping and pricing to ensure that I had at least a cursory knowledge of what I needed to do. And so one day in early 2012, I pulled the trigger on my little plan and ordered half a kilo of heroin for what amounted to 10 grand in cryptocurrency. Silk Road actually had seller reviews and a whole other seller reliability rating, and so I was easily able to find a highly rated heroin dealer who promised to hide my product in a small appliance of some kind before shipping it over. Part of me didn't really believe it would arrive, even though I knew the site was heavily policed in terms of fake reviews and scam sellers. And so when the package arrived, delivered by Royal Mail no less, my heart was thumping as I opened it up and disassembled what turned out to be a computer monitor. Now there it was, packed tightly in clear plastic baggies, half a kilo of pure golden brown Afghan heroin, enough to land me in prison from anywhere from 12 to 16 years. And after that, I had to find a buyer. And while you might assume that that was a relatively difficult process, it was not. I went into town on a Friday night, walked up to the first beggar I saw, and then told him that I'd give him a tenner if he showed me where to buy heroin. And that was all it took. He walked me to a phone, called a phone number after I handed him some change, and then about 15 minutes later, this teenage boy rode up on his bike and this beggar bought a bag of what he called brown from him. And that's when I stepped in and told the young lad on the bike that I wanted to talk to his boss. It was dark out, but I could still see the skeptical look that he gave me. But after a little exposition, he relented and asked for my phone number and then rode off saying that he'd pass it off to his boss. Not even 2 hours had elapsed before I got a call back and was making the half-hour walk to the dark, deserted street that I'd been told to wait on. And this is when I did something crucial and put on a ski mask. I made sure to keep myself out of sight, but that meant when a trio of what looked like hooded teenagers showed up, I almost scared the living daylights out of them when I'd stepped out to greet them. And once we'd confirmed that I was friendly, they told me to show them what I had, and since I had the good mind to bring a very small sample with me, I was only too willing to hand it over. They were still looking at me a bit funny since I was wearing the mask, but one of them, this poorly-looking lad who turned out to be older than the rest, dabbed a bit out onto his fist and then snorted it. I knew the product was pure, and therefore potent, but I wasn't ready for the effect it'd have on the user. It knocked him out on his feet. He couldn't talk, he couldn't keep his head raised, and he just sort of swayed on his feet while the other two boys just held back their laughter. Now they too seemed impressed with what I had, and then, after the old cliched question of, "You're not the police, are you?" they led me to the top floor of a block of flats to what you Americans would call the trap. And this is where I first met Steven. He made a really big deal out of the ski mask, aggressively at first, but then much more jovially as we got talking. He didn't like that I was wearing it, and then suddenly did like that I was wearing it. It made me a character, as he put it. There were more movie cliches when he and his boys had pat me down for a wire, and I was tempted to inform him that audio bugs were so small and reliable that I'd have one hidden in one of the buttons of my jacket, but I didn't. And after that, we got talking, and thanks to the sample, I didn't need to do much of it. The product spoke for itself thanks to the zombified junkie who had to be herded back to the flat. Stephen had a lot of questions, and I tried to answer as few of them as possible. I just simply told him that I had a lucrative business opportunity, and we could both get very rich off of it. And as you can imagine, this was music to his ears. He had his own bosses he needed to keep sweet, and the best way of doing that was making more money for them. And all he had to do was work with me, agree to my terms, and I'd get him the quality product that he needed to get an edge on the competition at a price he couldn't find anywhere else. That's how things started. And while things were a little bit shaky at first in terms of handoffs and keeping my identity a secret, I soon found a rhythm. I'd meet Stephen's couriers in varied but local locations, ensuring my face was covered in ways that preferably didn't attract attention. A scarf and sunglasses in the wintertime, for example, where I could just pull it up over my face nice and quickly. But whenever I met with Stephen face to not face, as it were, I wore the ski mask and sunglasses and never drove over in my car. Half kilos soon became kilos, but the most I ever sold at one time was 2 kilos. The most increasing variable after that was the frequency I would obtain packages. Because while the Silk Road was somewhat reliable, it wasn't foolproof. Not all poppy harvests yield the same quality product, so profit margins varied, and occasionally a trustworthy purveyor of quality goods would simply drop off the map for a while or nuke their account entirely. Delivering the packages to Stephen's couriers was also pretty nerve-wracking, and walking around with kilos of heroin on my person never got old. It was always terrifying. Always. But my God, did it make me a lot of money. I was paid in cash, bundles of it too, half of which I deposited in a very dodgy credit union run by 2 Bangladeshi blokes who took 10% for the privilege of washing my dosh, so to speak. Now the rest I spent on daily essentials, petrol, food shops, takeaways, stuff that doesn't raise any eyebrows when you pay with crisp 50-pound notes. And this went on for more than 2 years. Silk Road was shut down at one point, and its founder was arrested, but a replacement was set up in no time at all, so I was able to continue my dealings with Stephen after only the briefest of interruptions. But then came the day when I was almost caught, or at least that's what it felt like, because the package containing 2 kilos was just feet away from my front door when a police officer called at my flat to ask about a recent spate of burglaries. Now, it was still hidden away in its containers, the cavity of a rice cooker, so even if the officer came in and looked around, they wouldn't have suspected a thing. But paranoia is a hell of a drug, and that marked the first time that I began to consider giving it all up. I'd made a mind-boggling amount of money for such a small amount of overall work. Not quite £1 million, but close enough to feel like it. And once I had everything washed, I had enough to buy a house, enough to fritter away, and enough to squirrel away for the inevitable rainy days. And so I decided to quit while I was ahead. Now, I sold a few more packages to Stephen, even to put together some money to celebrate with once I'd made a clean break from the business. And then one day, I gave him a call to let him know that I was getting out. And I suppose it shows how utterly naive I still was that I thought that he'd be happy for me. We weren't friends, but we were fairly close. You can't not be if you're making so much money together. I think he wouldn't be over the moon about losing such a valuable asset, but I didn't think he'd get angry, and I certainly didn't think that he'd start threatening me. It turns out he did both. I called him, told him I was getting out, and at first, I could tell that he was nonplussed because of how quiet he went. Stephen was a talker, probably not the most ideal trait in a drug dealer, but that was just his way. So as I explained my plan to get out, and I didn't hear so much as a or an okay, I knew that he wasn't taking it well. But things got so much worse. Stephen was not accepting my resignation, and in a strange parody of a legitimate business, insisted I work a notice period before finally departing. Now, I offered to teach him about crypto and how to use the Silk Road, but Stephen was having none of it. He told me he had no obligations to people and that he couldn't downsize without first getting the right liquidity. Stephen would often incorrectly use business terms that he didn't understand, but his point was clear. Without me, he wouldn't make as much money, and he didn't fancy that one bit. Now, before long, Stephen was straight up threatening me. Myself, my family, my friends, anything that sprang to mind. But if there's one thing that I stayed consistent with, it was keeping my identity a secret to the point that my only identifying features were the clothes that I wore to meetings, which were outfits that I never wore anywhere else, and my voice. So unless Stephen had some piece of miracle technology which would hunt me down using the sound of my voice alone, he wouldn't know where to find me. And so with that in mind, I did what very few people have done throughout history, and I hung up on an angry gangster. I'm not going to pretend that I was Mr. Cool about it. It made for a terrifying experience, and once my nerves had settled and I could think clear and straight again, I realized that I had absolutely nothing to be afraid of. Me and Stephen didn't mix in the same circles, we didn't live in the same areas of the city, and I'd never seen him during daylight hours either, so I'm pretty sure that we even kept different sleep schedules. I wasn't worried about bumping into him or any of his other little cronies anywhere, and even if I did, all I had to do was keep my mouth shut and they wouldn't realize it was me. As far as I knew, I'd gotten away with illegally making hundreds of thousands of pounds completely scot-free. And bloody hell, did that feel good. After 6 months or so of lying low and not spending too much, in which time the Silk Road got shut down for good, I decided to make my very first luxury purchase from a Bentley dealership. It was a used Bentley, so considerably less expensive than a brand new one, but Bentley's pre-owned program is probably the best on the market, so you end up with a car that is as next to brand new as it's possible to get. I visited the dealership once or twice before, mostly just driving past to admire the display models. But once I was in the clear money-wise, I started talking to the salespeople to get an idea of pricing and availability. It took a couple of visits to nail down the model I wanted. The salesman saw a chance to flog something a bit more expensive to someone young and flashy, but I was after something a little more discreet. Those sorts of models tended not to be entered into the pre-owned system, so I had to wait about 6 weeks before one became available. But when one did, I zoomed over to the dealership and put down the deposit that secured the car as mine. It felt like a victory parade, and I was happy as a pig in crap as I sat with the salesman signing papers and swapping cheerful banter. The whole process lasted about 45 minutes, and in that time, the dealership was visited by 2 men who wandered around the display models and then spoke with a saleswoman. I didn't pay any attention to them. I was far too focused on feeling smug and ogling the pictures of my refurbished Bentley. And then when the final papers were signed and I was given a date to pick up the car, I shook the salesman's hand, thanked him for all his time, and then rose from my chair and headed for the showroom's exit. But as I did, I noticed one of the 2 men looking at me. But not just looking, staring while standing statue still about 10 feet away. Maybe it's having grown up in London, but I didn't immediately return the man's stare. I just thought, what the hell are you looking at, while trying not to provoke a confrontation. That might sound a bit extreme to some of you, but as I said, London might be one of the oldest cities in the world, but it's not the friendliest. That meant that it wasn't until I was within feet of the door that I shot the man a look, and when I did, my blood turned to ice. It was not some random toff stopping in to buy a brand new Bentley. In fact, it was the one person in the world that I didn't want it to be. It was Stephen. He was wearing a suit and tie, which is partly why he didn't grab my attention when I saw him in my peripheral vision, and he was staring at me like I'd just grown a second head. Now, I was right about to say something like, "Can I help you?" but I cut myself off and tried my very best to keep a neutral look on my face as I turned it away from him. But no sooner had I done that, he asked me, "Do I know you?" Stephen had been listening to me speak to the salesman for about 15 to 20 minutes, so I'm amazed that he hadn't had the realization earlier. But I knew what a precarious position I was in there, so I just stared back at him and simply shook my head before continuing on my way. My heart felt like it was trying to burst out of my chest by the time I was out the doors, and I had to summon every ounce of bravery I had not to sprint to my car and drive off doing 100. But as I started my engine and drove out of the dealership, I saw Stephen standing just outside the doors with his phone in his hand, quite clearly taking pictures or video as I was driving off. And as I drove, it felt like my heart was going into palpitations or I was having a panic attack or something. My vision started getting very gray around the edges, and I was taking shallower and shallower breaths. As much as I was scared I might crash my car, I knew I couldn't stop because Stephen might just be a few cars behind me. I didn't drive home. I was going to, but then realized how stupid that was given what had just happened, and turned to drive in the opposite direction. I ended up clocking maybe 5 or 6 miles before I turned into the car park of an apartment building and turned off my engine. That was the first real chance I had to stop and think, which felt like a relief at first because at least I wasn't going to lose concentration and crash my car. But it turned out to be anything but, because stopping only allowed the crushing reality of the situation to set in. Stephen had recognized me. There was no doubt about that. Enough that he wanted a record of my number plate so he could no doubt follow up on a strongly held suspicion. And when he did, when the man who'd vowed to kill me finally found me, he'd probably do things that'd make me want to die before he eventually ended me entirely. And as I contemplated that, the hazy vision panic returned and I found myself struggling to breathe. It took a minute, but I managed to calm myself enough that I could think straight, and then as I did so, the solution came to me clear as day, but it was an unthinkable one. The first part, and possibly the easiest, was abandoning my car in that car park, and the next was calling my girlfriend to tell her that she had to go and stay with her mom. She could tell something was wrong just from the sound of my voice, and I promised I'd explain everything face to face as soon as I could. But in the meantime, she had to leave the flat that we shared as quickly as possible and never return to it. Now, it took me hours to walk home, so I had plenty of time to try and reason with her, but in the end, she did as I asked. Then, when I myself got home, I packed up all the essentials, including the bricks of cash that I kept hidden away, and then took a taxi to a friend's house and asked if I could stay with him for a few days. I ended up borrowing his car to drive over to my girlfriend's mom's place, and after sitting her down in private in an upstairs bedroom, I told her everything. She had no idea that I'd been trafficking heroin. She thought that I was repairing all the appliances that I was being sent and then returning them to their owners. My excuse for the Bentley was that I'd been saving it for since I was 16, and since I had an okay salary and was good with money, she bought the excuse without asking any questions. I had this naive idea that she'd stay with me and accept my invitation to move to another city with me, but she didn't. In fact, she broke up with me there and then and said that she never wanted to hear from me ever again. Dealing drugs was one thing, but putting us in danger was another. And if it was only a matter of time before they found me through my car's registration, then she said I needed to leave right that instant. And that was the last time me and her spoke. Then the next day, after buying my mate's car from him for an eye-watering amount of cash, I drove up north, never to return to London. It broke my heart to do it. My parents didn't understand why I was leaving, and since I couldn't bring myself to tell them the truth, I made up a lie about finding a better job in the Northwest. They don't question why I never come to visit, and I'm always insisting that they come to visit me, but I think they suspect something by now. Maybe one day I'll tell them about the stupid, arrogant mistake I made and how it was that which destroyed my relationships and forced me into exile. I ended up selling that Bentley too, by the way, and I had it delivered to Manchester, and it was somewhat of a comfort at first, but it quickly became an enduring reminder of my own greed, as well as the pure devastation that the deep web had caused. Okay, so the TLDR of this is don't F around with the deep web. So even if you don't read this whole thing, take that lesson to heart for the love of God. So I used to screw around with cryptocurrencies in a very big way actually, but I won't bore you with all the nerdy little details. Just know that I was 4 digits into it and always looking for a chance to grow my pot. And so one of the major places for crypto dudes to congregate was the deep web. And this is mostly because they believe the surface web was heavily monitored, which I guess it is, obviously. But it's here that I was introduced to someone named Andre by a mutual friend. Andre said that he ran a crypto investment fund out of Belarus, and that if I made an investment, I could get double, maybe even triple the returns in just a matter of months. Now, the friend who introduced us said that Andre was legit, and so after a few weeks of talking back and forth to see if I could trust the guy, I transferred him the same amount in Bitcoin that my buddy did and then waited to see what he could do with it. Well, as it turned out, Andre could do a lot with it. And week after week, he showed me how the amount in my little pot was growing, and at first it started off slow, but as time went on, that relatively small number got bigger and bigger and bigger. And eventually it got to the point where I didn't want to risk losing such a large amount of crypto. It wasn't exactly some life-changing amount, but withdrawing then meant that I had literally 10 times more money than when I first started. But when I reached out to Andre and asked him how I would go about doing that, he made it very clear that it'd be a very foolish thing to back out then. And he told me not to lose my nerve, and that within a few months my pot could be worth tens of thousands of dollars instead of just a few thousand. I wanted more money, that goes without saying, but at the same time, I knew the longer that he was out there, the bigger the risk of losing it. And so I told Andre that, respectfully, that I'd like to withdraw what I'd earned. Now, he couldn't exactly stop me, but he was incredibly insistent. Not quite to the point of intimidation, but that was just around the corner, it seems. He didn't actually turn on me until I tried to withdraw the amount, at which point I only got back the amount that I initially invested, even though my wallet with Andre now said 0. And that's when I realized that the whole thing was a scam, and how whatever was going on, I certainly wasn't making any money from it personally. Now, I tried complaining to my friend about it, the one who'd put me in touch with Andre, but then he turned on me too. I tried warning him that Andre wasn't what he'd seemed, but my friend wouldn't listen. He told me that I made a big mistake in withdrawing my crypto because I put the whole system in jeopardy for everyone else. Now, it still wasn't too late to reinvest, in which case there would be no harm, no foul, but not doing so would leave everyone hanging dry, himself included. And that's when I realized that my friend, emphasis on the quotation marks there, must have been in on it, because nothing I said to him seemed to make a single bit of difference. All that mattered to him was getting me to reinvest by any means necessary, including threats. He told me Andre and his friends were not people I wanted to mess with, but since I was pretty adept at online security, I didn't think that they'd be able to find me. Now, I think on their own that they wouldn't be able to, but since I strongly suspect it was my so-called friend who betrayed my IP address to them, it was easy. Now, it started when they did something to my computer. Something that made it freeze up before an Internet Explorer window opened and some kind of program downloaded and installed itself as I'm screaming no, 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 no over and over. Now, I tried saving my PC by pulling all the wires out of the back, and I even double-checked that my VPN had been properly functioning at the time of the attack. I thought I'd disconnected it just in time, but just a few days later, weird things started happening around my apartment building. I first noticed when I came home that the window nearest my fire escape was open. It didn't look like anyone had been inside my apartment, but I very clearly remember closing the window before I left my apartment that morning. And that was enough to have me looking for someplace else to stay, at least until things blew over. But literally the same night that I went and backed up all my essentials, someone stole my car and I woke up to a note in my mailbox that just said, "Reinvest." Now, I went to stay with my mom that very same day, and over the next couple of days I reported my car stolen and canceled the month-to-month lease on my apartment. It was devastating because I had to basically trash all my devices on the assumption that they were compromised, and it took me years before I was able to fully replace everything. But that wasn't the worst of it. On the day my lease ended, I returned to my apartment to pick up the rest of my things. But when I did, something was waiting for me. I was walking towards my mom's car with a bag of clothes under each arm when a car started to turn down the lot and speeded towards me as it passed. It ended up crashing into the car that I took cover behind, and as it drove off, my mom started to freak the hell out of having to almost watch her boy get smushed. Only then did I come clean on what had happened to me, and you can call me a mama's boy if you want, but seeing her go full bear mama after I had told her was kinda cool. And she sent me to live with my uncle out of state for a while, and she got my dad to teach her how to shoot his gun just in case someone came around in my dad's house looking for me. She made a difficult time a lot easier, and she even offered me a few $100s to get myself a new laptop and a new phone. And I paid her back once I got access to my crypto and cashed it out, but I really appreciated what she and my uncle did for me at a time when I honestly thought that I might end up getting murdered over some damn crypto scheme. I don't even know how it all worked either. Like, I think Andre was using our money to make it look like he had this big investment network, which attracted people in the same way a Ponzi scheme does, but I don't know for certain. All I know is that whoever he was, he must have been working with some serious people if they were able to hunt me down and willingly do me harm. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday night. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of this YouTube channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul that you should totally check out and subscribe to. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, that's all the time we have today, folks. Why I oughta.